Tractate Niddah, the final tractate of the Talmud, covers the laws of ritual purity and impurity, particularly in regards to menstruation. As a general preface, there are many forms of impurity for both men and women in various states, and for various impure objects, things like particular crawling animals, corpses, and otherwise. One of these particularly is a woman who is menstruating, where, on top of being ritually impure, her husband is forbidden to have relations with her during this period. Chapter 1 will begin the discussion on these laws. The first person says, Shammai holds, women begin their status of impurity from the time that they find that they've discharged blood, while Hillel holds she's impure from the last time she examined herself until this current time, even if it's a number of days. The sages say she can only be retroactively impure at a limit of 24 hours. If a woman has a fixed menstrual period, she's considered impure from the time she finds that she has a discharge. A woman who checks herself with a cloth after having marital relations is considered to have examined herself in regards to these timings. For example, if a woman had a fixed menstrual cycle, if the woman is sitting and handling pure foods, she gets up and then she finds that she has blood internally, she would be impure, but the foods would retain their pure status. Although the sages say she becomes impure for 24 hours before she examines herself, her Niddah period, her period of impurity, is counted from the moment that she discovers blood. The Gemara says, Shammai holds his opinion, as he says the woman is in a presumed state of purity until proven otherwise, while Hillel would disagree with this presumption, as the fact that she started her menstruation shows a change in status. This is different from the laws of a mikveh, which have additional factors. There's a similar principle by laws of wine that turn to vinegar. It has a retroactive change status, as there are additional factors. It further seeks to compare the laws of purity by a mikveh to points of presumptive purity by a sota, which is a debated principle. Another apparent contradiction to Shammai's opinion by a sheretz creature found in an alley. It renders impurity retroactively, unlike Shammai's opinion. But again, this is said to be as there is an additional factor, as there are sheretz creatures indigenous to the alley and foreign ones too, so it's similar to there being additional factors. Or alternatively, simply Shammai holds menstruation is different than all of these, saying that there's no retroactive impurity at all, as a woman could tell if she's begun menstruation, and if she's asleep, she would have woken up. Hillel would say she would attribute the sensation to a different bodily function, which is why he disagrees. And Shammai would agree with Hillel if the woman was mentally incompetent. Another alternative explanation of Shammai, who holds there's no retroactive impurity by menstruation, as he holds that the blood only came out here initially. Well, Hillel would disagree, as he would say that there could be internal bleeding, and it just wasn't fully discharged. Shammai would therefore agree with Hillel here if the woman cohabited while having a cloth inserted to prevent potential blood discharges. Others disagree with this unless the cloth is compressed. It brings sources that hold like this explanation. Another explanation of Shammai's opinion, it was just something he instituted so as to not prevent couples from engaging in cohabitation. It debates this from further sources. There's a different case where if a box is used to store pure foods and a sheretz creature is found in the opposite corner, it's debated if the foods retain their purity. It's clarified this debate exists if the box has no bottom, otherwise it would be agreed that the foods are impure. It debates these opinions from a few sources. There are various other interpretations of this debate. Some states only debated where the box was examined beforehand. Some states where the box was covered. Other states actually the box is being moved between the corners of the house. It's discussed. There's a quoted case, if there's a loaf of bread on a shelf and there's an impure garment beneath and somebody finds the bread on the floor past the garment, you don't need to assume that it fell and hit the impure garment, as even if the shelf is on an incline, it's valid to assume that a person just picked it up and moved it, if that was possible. There is a general principle that anything with possible impurity in a public domain is considered to be impure, but this loaf is different, either as it's a loaf of bread, so unlike a person that became impure, you can't ask the loaf of bread what happened, or as it only has a degree of rabbinic impurity, so it's treated leniently. It further expands on the opinion of the sages that there is retroactive impurity by menstruation, but it's limited to 24 hours. This is, as Jewish women were supposed to check themselves every morning and evening, so it goes back 24 hours to these periods. That's further explained. Regarding the woman with a fixed cycle, this is said to suffice, although it's disputed in the event that she finds blood outside of her fixed cycle. That's further discussed. Regarding examinations after cohabitation, it's said that if a woman checks prior to cohabitation, it's not valid as she'll be in a rush and not necessarily checked properly. Post-cohabitation checking is sufficient, and this is specified either as there's no concern that a small amount of blood will be covered by other bodily fluids, or it's saying checking both before and after is required even if the woman has a fixed cycle. The remaining points are qualified further, and these are discussed. Anyways, it said that this 24-hour of retroactive impurity applies to Niddah impurity. It would also apply to sacrificial foods, but it would not apply to teruma tithes. It debates that from several related conversations, and it further discusses as to whether or not this principle would actually apply to the laws of teruma, as there are varying views between several opinions. It additionally quotes principles regarding the challah tithe as to whether this retroactive impurity principle would or would not apply. New Mishnah. It said that there are 4 women whose set menstruation cycles suffice by these laws: a virgin, a pregnant woman, a nursing woman, and an old woman. Some say it's only by the first, but it's held to apply by all 4. Oh, virgin here does not refer to a woman who has never cohabited. It refers to a woman who has never menstruated. A pregnant woman here starts from when her fetus is noticeable. A nursing woman lasts until she weans her child. If she uses a wet nurse or weaned prematurely or the child passed away, some say if she discharges blood, it would apply impurity retroactively. Others say she maintains her set cycle. An old woman here is an older woman who goes through 3 cycles without menstruation. Some say this would even apply if this occurs to a younger woman. Some even say by a pregnant or a nursing woman, if they pass 3 cycles without menstruation, their set cycle suffices. This set cycle works for the first discharge. If she had a second discharge, then it would convey impurity for 24 hours retroactively beforehand, as it typically would. If her first discharge was due to an external stimulus, then the second one suffices without retroactivity. The Gemara further explains this debate if these principles apply to the 4 women, or just the first one. We follow the opinion that it follows all 4 and lists a number of other rulings on laws of impurity in accordance with this opinion. It also lists a few of his held laws outside the laws of impurity, such as principles by miyun and the levirate marriage that the court should advise a girl to reject a miyun arrangement in a particular case, and otherwise. There's some related discussion, and it further discusses the legal status regarding the concept of a virgin as it applies to people, to soil, or trees, and as to whether a woman who has never menstruated falls into this category. Regarding the pregnant woman, which is referenced as being once her fetus becomes noticeable, this is based on the verse regarding Tamar, where it says she was noticed to be pregnant after 3 months had passed, which applies even if the woman is giving birth prematurely. There's further discussion on this. It asks, if a woman finds she has blood and then notices the fetus, that she's pregnant, it debates whether the retroactive impurity would apply or not, as she was technically pregnant beforehand. It said the retroactivity would still apply here. It also asks, if the woman's fixed menstrual cycle begins during her pregnancy and she doesn't check herself in accordance with the opinion that fixed cycles are of biblical law, it's debated whether examination was actually required. It says it would not be. It's stated if a nursing woman's child passes within 24 months of its birth, the mother's status reverts to the default, and she continues becoming impure retroactively upon menstruation. Others say this would apply 24 hours after childbirth, even without nursing. The logic would be, respectively, either that the woman's milk production draws off of her blood and prevents menstruation, or that the woman's childbirth weakens her and prevents menstruation. It cites sources. The definition of old age, according to some, is that if her friends say she's old. Others say it's somebody who is not embarrassed or possibly does not resent being called the title of mother. The length of a set cycle is that, as mentioned, when 3 pass, it establishes a lack of menstruation. It's said to be either 30 days or 20 days. It cites some related cases on this. And it additionally qualifies the establishment of a menstrual cycle for a girl regarding the first time the cycle begins. This is further discussed along with the remaining points. Regarding the establishment of a menstrual cycle through an external stimulus, it states an opinion that if somebody jumps in the air and causes blood to be discharged 3 times, this establishes a fixed cycle so long as it's done in accordance with the days of the cycle. This is qualified. New Mishnah. A woman who has a fixed cycle should nevertheless still check, unless she's already a Niddah, or within the specific set week after the birth of a child, where she'll be pure even if there is blood. Similarly, a woman with a fixed cycle who cohabits should still check with a cloth, unless it's in those weeks after childbirth, or if she's a virgin whose blood wouldn't cause impurity. She should examine herself twice a day, by morning and evening, and when she goes to have marital relations. Kohanim women must also check if they want to eat teruma, and some even say after they finish eating teruma. The Gemara clarifies, regarding a woman with a fixed cycle who's a Niddah, according to the opinion that she can establish her cycle during her Niddah period, this would only apply if she wasn't previously menstruating. It debates the application of the point on impurity in the weeks after childbirth. That's further discussed. It was said that a woman should check herself twice a day. Some clarify this applies regarding eating pure foods, and it's not necessary for being with her husband. Additionally, they hold a woman can be with her husband, but it's argued regarding if she doesn't have a fixed cycle. Some say she must check herself prior. That's discussed. Some would even say that a woman who isn't handling pure foods should specifically not check herself prior to cohabitation in case the husband gets nervous and they end up separating. It further debates policy of a woman checking herself right after cohabitation. It was said before, one opinion holds that a woman without a fixed cycle must check herself prior to cohabitation. Here, this would apply whether the woman was awake or asleep. It debates these principles from other sources. One stringent opinion holds that a woman without a fixed cycle cannot have marital relations. Out of concern, she'll begin bleeding during cohabitation, and as she can't cohabit, she wouldn't be given her marriage contract, and by extension, the other forms of sustenance and clothing. Additionally, the husband must divorce her and can't later remarry her, even if she establishes a fixed cycle. Others say the husband would still need to pay the marriage contract in such a case. We do hold the law that if a woman does not have a set menstrual cycle, she is permitted to cohabit with her husband, as long as she checks herself before and after, and it argues that this has application to pure foods or otherwise. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Niddah continues discussing the laws of Niddah, impurity. The first Mishnah says, if a woman excessively checks herself to see if she's had an impure emission, that's considered praiseworthy. But if a man excessively checks himself, that's a very improper thing to do. The Gemara says the difference between a female or a male checking themselves is that it's improper for a male to check himself, even at all, not just excessively, as touching himself there is inappropriate and could lead to other transgressions. Others say it could be permissible for a male to check himself if he's a Zov, which is a different, irregular type of emission that'll be discussed in future chapters. The male can check himself with a thick cloth, as seen from other cases. Related, it said that a male should never touch his genitals, not even when urinating, as it could lead to a particular transgression which is treated very severely, and is compared by various teachings to be akin to murder, possibly idolatry and otherwise. There was a case that it was said to be permissible for somebody to touch his genitals while urinating, but that was an exception, either as he was preoccupied because it was at night, or he was on a roof, or possibly as he was just a very God-fearing individual, as some say it's impermissible to hold the skin around the area. As the general principle essentially is that a male shouldn't be touching himself there because it could lead to certain transgressions. It further cites many teachings and points on the severity of the prohibition against these. It additionally speaks on other things that are said to be tremendously wrong to do, such as converts who don't follow the mitzvahs properly as they delay the coming of Mashiach. And it's also said that if a person marries a girl who's too young to reproduce, this is also a tremendously wrong thing to do, and it delays the coming of Mashiach. Further, the exact wording of the Mishnah was that if a male excessively checks himself, his hand should be cut off. It's unresolved if this is just a curse or it's a literal law. New Mishnah. A deaf woman, a deranged woman, a blind woman, and an insane woman, they should have somebody mentally competent help them purify in a mikveh, and they could then eat terumatad if that's relevant. The Gemara clarifies, a deaf woman here refers to one who also cannot speak. Also, some say a blind woman should actually be excluded from this list, as she could just show her examination cloth to somebody who can see. The difference between a deranged and an insane woman is that an insane woman is one who lost her mind due to an illness. Regarding a deranged Kohen, he's immersed in the evening, and he's given teruma to eat, and he's washed as if he sleeps. He goes back to being ritually impure. Some say he should be made to wear a leather pouch around himself, so that way they'll be able to check if he's become impure from an emission. Others say this isn't allowed, as such a garment could cause an emission. Others say it would be allowed if it's made out of metal. Related, some hold that there would be similar problems with riding an animal unsaddled, as it could lead a person to have an emission. Others say it's fine if he rides side saddle. Additionally, it's said to be very wrong to sleep on your back, as it could lead to these issues, although you can lean to your side a bit, although you still shouldn't say the Shema prayer like this. New Mishnah. It was the practice by cohabitation to have an examination cloth for both the man and the woman after, and some would even have a third cloth for themselves prior. If blood is found on the man's cloth, both he and the woman are ritually impure, and they must bring a chatas sin offering to the temple. If the blood was found on the woman's cloth immediately after, both are ritually impure, and they must bring a chatas offering. If she found blood on her cloth after a while, being the length of time for the woman to leave the bed and clean herself, they are impure due to a doubt, and they don't need to bring an offering. If she examines herself later than this, and she finds blood, she's retroactively impure for 24 hours beforehand, but she doesn't cause a severe level of impurity to somebody she cohabited with 24 hours beforehand. But others say she does, and they end up conceding to this opinion. The Gemara says, there's no possibility the blood on the cloth was from a louse, either as lice don't go there or there just isn't room. There's a practical difference if there was a crushed lice found on the cloth, if we assume the blood was from the lice or otherwise. Related, if a woman checked herself with a clean cloth and pressed it against her thigh and then found blood on her thigh, it's held that she would be impure as a niddah. If the woman checked herself with a cloth that wasn't pre-inspected, and then she put it in a box and then found blood on the cloth later on, one sage originally held her to be ritually impure as a niddah, but then he later changed his ruling. This principle is debated further. Regarding the timing of an immediate examination, this refers to the time to do an external examination, not an internal one. If the blood was found on the woman's cloth after this time, it's said that she's exempt from an offering. Others hold that she actually would still need to bring an Asham Taloy offering. There are different definitions as to the length of these time periods that are listed. These are discussed further along with some debate on what the retroactive impurity would encompass. New Mishnah. All women are in a presumptive state of purity to their husbands, even if the husband came back from a trip. The Gemara says, it mentions this applies even when the husband comes back from a trip, as previously when the husband was gone, the woman might not necessarily have been checking herself properly. Some say this only applies in the 30 days after a menstruation, and if she has a fixed cycle and it arrives while he was away, then she would then need to check herself. Others dispute this based on if the concern by a fixed cycle is biblical or rabbinic. That's debated further from various opinions along with some other points. It argues from additional sources as to whether the concern by the start of a woman's fixed cycle is of biblical or rabbinic origin. New Mishnah. Beis Shammai says, a woman who deals with pure foods must check herself with 2 cloths for both before and after cohabitation, for each act of cohabitation done, or she can just use one and inspect it by a lamp. Beis Hillel says she only needs 2 cloths for the whole night. The Gemara additionally disputes these opinions. It is debated further as to if it's necessary for a person to check himself in between separate acts of cohabitation. We bring sources that it's not necessary. Additionally, it's said that in the earlier case, that if a man returned from a trip, he doesn't need to assume that his wife is a Niddah. This applies if he left while she was in a pure state. If she was impure, she maintains the status until she informs him otherwise. Some do say if a woman checks herself with a cloth after having relations and then lost the cloth, she cannot have relations until she rechecks herself. This is different than if she just had never checked in the first place, as here the cloth could have been examined immediately. Related, it brings many verses that show how it's very wrong for a person to cohabit by day and that it should only be done by night, as verses imply conception occurs by night. There are further teachings that said that God dislikes those who enter their home suddenly without warning, or another's home, somebody who holds his organ while urinating, as discussed earlier in this chapter. Somebody who urinates without any clothing on is wrong, or somebody who urinates before his bed, and it's also said to be a very wrong thing to cohabit with slaves. It additionally cites many practices that are said to be very unhealthy, like eating certain foods, sleeping in a cemetery, putting fingernails in a public area, and bloodletting, and then having relations afterwards. These are discussed along with further points on the prohibition to cohabit by day. Some do say it would be permitted to do this if the house itself is dark. It's discussed from our conversation regarding the lamp. It said that the family of the king Munbaz would do 3 praiseworthy things. They would have marital relations by day, but this is explained to mean that they would inspect their beds by day. They would examine their beds with cotton, and they would observe the laws of impurity regarding snow, which can be classified as either food or a drink. New Mishnah. To refer to the anatomical parts of a woman, it uses metaphor to be polite regarding these laws. There is the room, a reference to the womb, the corridor, the actual canal, and the attic, a reference to the upper cavity. If blood is from the room, it's impure. If it's from the attic, it's pure. If it's in the corridor, it could have come from the womb, so it's ruled to be impure. The Gemara says, some said if blood was found in the corridor by the womb, it's ruled impure. If it was at the front of the corridor, it's ruled to be pure. Others say actually if it's in the back, it's definitely impure, and if it's in the front, it's a doubt and it's ruled to be impure. Others say it's considered to be doubtfully impure no matter where it is, or possibly it's definitely impure if it's in the back and pure if it's in the front, depending on the individual logic. There is a source which says that there's a debate if blood in the corridor is considered to be definitively impure or not. It's debated how this would apply by each of these laws. Generally, there are 3 times where the majority is followed within a law. By the womb, as was just discussed, that blood within the passage is deemed definitely impure, and also by afterbirth, where there's no child to tell that the fetus must have dissolved prior, making the house it's within not become impure. And finally, by a dismembered limb, that if a woman miscarried such a limb, the mother is considered to be impure through birth, as we follow majority and we don't assume the fetus was underdeveloped. It debates why other particular rulings, by laws of kosher purchases and by other laws of impurity, aren't listed here in regards to following the majority, as we're discussing specifically laws of impurity by a woman. It also brings cases that don't have this principle applied by further laws of impurity. Regarding women and the laws of Niddah impurity, there are essentially 5 shades of blood that are considered to be blood to cause impurity. Red, black, the purple shade similar to the edge of a crocus flower, the color of earth water, and the color of diluted wine. Others add the color of fenugreek water and liquid on roasted meat. Others disagree with those last 2. It's a debate if yellow blood renders impurity for blood, and then it's also a debate if it renders impurity just as a typical fluid. The shade red, as mentioned, is just typical blood color of a wound. Black is in reference to an ink pigment, and any shade darker than that, anything lighter would be pure. The crocus flower refers to the reddest part of the flower. Earth water color refers to earth, specifically from the valley of Beis Kerem. The diluted wine color referenced refers to wine from Sharon, and diluted with 2 parts water to 1 part wine. The Gemara brings Scriptural sources showing that there's a limit to blood impurity based on the shade and how these particular shades are the ones said to cause impurity. The differing opinions of the Mishnah debate their interpretations based on verses. When it said blood of a wound, some define this as blood of a slaughtered ox, others say it's blood from a live bird, and it's unresolved if it specifically refers to a healthy bird. Others say it means the blood color of blood from a lice. Others say this shade of blood refers very specifically to blood of a cut on a little finger that was reopened specifically on a young, unmarried man under the age of 20. Others just say it's the shade of blood by bloodletting. If further debates as to what exactly the shade of black refers to, it mentions various types of cloths and materials that it could be referencing. Some say regarding all of the mentioned colors, we said that by specifically the black shade, anything darker is impure and anything lighter is pure. So it's a debate if that principle would also apply by the other shades. Some say the exception is the diluted wine shade, which would be pure if it's lighter or darker. It further qualifies which exact parts of the crocus plant is being referenced and what shade is referenced by the earth water. It lists many instances of identifying the purity or impurity of blood based on the examination process. If a sage declares a particular shade of blood to be pure, it's a debate if somebody can say, based on that, an identical shade would also be pure without confirming. These are further discussed. It's also said some would do these examinations by a candle, others would do so on a cloudy day by the pillars of the school, others say it should be done between the sun and the shade, others say in the sun but shadowed under your hand, so that way you'll be able to gauge the color accurately because it varies depending on the light source. It further defines what exactly the shade of wine refers to and how precisely it's examined. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Niddah continues on the laws of purity and impurity. The first Mishnah says, it says over here that if a woman gives birth to a male child, she is impure for 7 days, and then she's pure for 33 days. Well, if she has a female child, then she's impure for 14 days, and then pure for 66 days. During these periods of purity following the impure stages, then she could not become impure even if she experiences bleeding. However, this chapter discusses the principles if she has a miscarriage as to what would be considered a developed child sufficiently to fall into these laws. If a woman miscarries a formless mass, some say she's only impure as a niddah if there's blood within, others say she's impure no matter what. If she discharges something similar to a shell, hair, dust, or midges, and it's colored red, it should be placed in water. If it dissolves, she's impure, and if it does not, she's pure. If a woman miscarries something that resembles an animal or a bird, if it's a male, she observes the period of impurity for birthing a male. If it's a female, she does the period of impurity for birthing a female. If she can't tell the gender, she does the stringency of both. Others say simply, if it doesn't have a human form, it's not considered to be a child. The Gemara says, regarding the formless mass, some hold there's only impurity if it's one of the specified shades of impure blood. This is disputed based on if we assume formless masses tend to be of these shades. Others explain the dispute to be on whether a uterus can open without bleeding. This is paralleled in other discussions, and there are other different opinions on the purity status of an expelled formless mass. Some say to open it up and check for blood, and if there is, she's impure, otherwise not. Others say she's impure if the interior is red, and others say she's impure if there's a bone inside. There's a question, impurity is caused by a blood flow coming through the internal canal of the woman's body, but what if there was an interposition, such as that the blood was expelled through a tube? That's debated. Many say she's pure, as the verse specifically says her flesh to exclude such a unique situation. That's discussed. It also debates if a man had an emission through a tube that was inserted inside of him, whether that would create impurity. And it debates what the purity status of a woman is if she initially discharges dried blood. Broadly, it said if one of these odd discharges dissolves in water, it's assumed to be blood and it would cause impurity, and if it doesn't, it's assumed to be an independent entity. There were the instances of a woman who expelled a shell-like substance or hair, wherein she was told by the doctors that she must have had a lesion or a mole within her reproductive system, and it was deemed to be an independent entity if it didn't dissolve in water in that case. Some said to dissolve it in lukewarm water, others say it should be squashed with pressure against the fingernail with saliva. It's unresolved how long it needs to soak in water for as to whether this is comparable to a shark's creature, which soaks for 24 hours. It further debates the status of a woman who dispels a mass that resembles some sort of a creature. That's argued from a number of verses. And it additionally debates this regarding a number of different forms of masses resembling different parts of different animals. One sage asked as a joke to the sage of Zivah, if a woman expels an animal-like fetus and the father accepts a betrothal for it, if this would prevent the husband from marrying the mass's sister, and it says that Reb Zera did not find this very amusing. It does say if a woman aborts a fetus that resembles an animal, she's only impure if the mass is capable of surviving. So according to this, the mass has a similar legal status to a child. But what if an animal has a human-like fetus? What then? Is it permitted to be eaten or not? So that's unresolved. Specifically, if it has the body of an animal and the face of a human, it's agreed that it would cause impurity, and if it had the body of a human and the face of an animal, it's agreed that it would not cause impurity. The debate as stated above is if it had a human face and an animal eye. As some say, for it to cause impurity, it must have part of a human form. Others say it must have a fully human form. Some say it causes impurity only if both sides of the face have human form. Others say it's if only half has human form. It said if a fetus has one eye or one leg, it causes impurity if it's to the side, but if it's in the middle of the body, it would not cause impurity. If the fetus's esophagus is perforated, it would cause impurity. If it's blocked, it does not. If a woman miscarries an incomplete body, being the amount of body missing to cause death, this would not cause impurity of childbirth. It debates how much missing body this would be if the miscarriage has the hands and the legs both extending from the shoulders. Again, this is not considered to be a birth and it causes no impurity. It's a debate if the fetus's face is disfigured and indiscernible, what the status would be then. If the woman miscarries something with two spines, or if an animal miscarries this, some say neither are considered to be a birth, and there's no impurity, and by the animal it can't be eaten. Others disagree and say that it would be impure. That's debated. It said that a woman typically gives birth at 9 months, and can sometimes give birth prematurely at 7 months. It debates if an animal also gives birth prematurely at 7 months, if this animal is considered viable. It says, if a woman gives birth to a fetus that resembles the demon Lilith, the mother is impure, as it's a valid child that just happens to have wings. It brings sources. Emission. If a woman miscarries an embryo full of water, full of blood, or full of multicolored fluids, she's not impure from childbirth. If the embryo was developed with the form of limbs, the woman must observe the stringencies of impurity for giving birth to a male and to a female. If a woman aborts a sandal, a deformed, flattened fetus alongside a child, or just plain afterbirth, she also observes stringencies of impurity for giving birth to both a female and a male. The Gemara says, the embryo full of multicolored fluids isn't a child, as either drinking wine doesn't reduce an actual fetus to this extent, or if it was an actual fetus, it wouldn't be full, or if it was an actual fetus, it would have just been one color. There are further points on the effects of drinking wine on one's body, and it says a few incidents which are generally interpreted as metaphor. The sage Abba Shaul chased after a deer, and entered into a corpse's thigh bone, being the corpse of the giant Og, king of Bashan, and chased the deer inside to the end, being 3 parsecs long. Another time, he fell through a cave and found himself standing in the eye of a corpse up to his nose, this being the eye of Avshalom. It says that this was even as Abba Shaul was an extremely tall man, and it also lists the height of various other stages. It further debates the status of an embryo full of flesh and similar fluids, and it also defines a developed embryo. Some say it's got a head-like formation with a vague semblance of eyes, nostrils, and a mouth. To determine its gender, it describes the examination process, which is done by poking the embryo's lower area with a splinter from the bottom to the top to see if it catches on anything. It further describes what a fetus looks like when it's in its initial stages of development. It said its legs and arms look like crimson threads. Some say that an embryo is only considered to be a viable child if it has hair on its head. This is a very stringent, imprecise ruling, going as strictly as possible, as the sage said this was an expert on this subject and he wanted people to hold stricter opinions. We said if a woman miscarries a flat piece of flesh, she has impurity for having both a male and a female. It describes what such a miscarriage looks like, and it rules it needs to have some facial feature to be considered a child and give off this impurity. This applies no matter where the facial feature is on the head. It is asked, why was this even stated, as the way such a flattened fetus is created is when its twin crushes it in the womb, so there's a properly developed child being born anyways, which would create the impurity. So it's explained this is where it was a proper male and a flattened miscarriage, which could possibly be a female, which could lessen the amount of pure days. Or it could be where she gave birth to a female before sunset, and the flattened fetus after sunset, so it covers 2 different days in case the latter is also potentially a female. Such a miscarriage is relevant in the laws of firstborn redemption, as it could make its twin only a firstborn for inheritance, not to be redeemed by a Cohen. It is also relevant in that it shows if a woman gives birth to a healthy child via C-section and this miscarriage normally, she brings an offering for the miscarriage. And according to those that say a C-section is a valid birth, this is relevant if a non-Jewish woman had a regular child and then converted and had such a miscarriage. She'd bring an offering for the latter. To clarify, as it's explained that such a flattened miscarriage comes out pressed against its twin, it's where they're pressed against each other in opposite directions, so that way it's possible that one could come out first. Or it's that they're actually precisely aligned, it's just that the live child could try to actively stay in the womb, or it's that as the child is alive, it's considered born once its head comes out, and by the miscarriage is only born once majority comes out. out. New Mishnah. If there's afterbirth in a house, the house is impure even though there's no child in the afterbirth, although some say that a fetus actually did disintegrate into this fluid. The Gemara spent some time describing what this looks like and its measurements, which is larger than a handbreadth. It also mentions some other things that have larger measurements than a handbreadth, being a shofar, a lulav, a sukkah wall, width, and hyssop for purification. It didn't mention anything that's a handbreadth by a handbreadth. Likewise, some laws of impurity and other qualifications are mentioned as to why other things are excluded from this list. For instance, it doesn't mention anything that's subject to a dispute or that's explicitly written in the Torah, like some measurements of temple implements. It doesn't mention any sanctified items or rabbinic enactments. Essentially, it's only discussing things written in Torah that don't have their measurement specified, that are listed as being listed as over a handbreadth. Anyways, it said that for the first 3 days after childbirth, any afterbirth would be attributed to the child that was born. This is explained to be only if the previous born child was actually a miscarriage, and some add that it must be an underdeveloped fetus specifically. It is clarified, the afterbirth is only attributed to a fetus that looks like a species that has afterbirth. So if the fetus looks like a raven, we don't assume the afterbirth was from it. It asks, what if the afterbirth is attached to a bird fetus, which it proves was a thing from a case. It lists some cases where afterbirth was attributed to a birth much later, sometimes even months after, which it repeatedly questions the legitimacy of. It clarifies the principles by the impurity extending across the house and their individual logics. Additional principles and laws of corpse impurity are quoted. The reason the latter opinions that afterbirth with the dissolved fetus itself is pure is as he holds it's nullified by majority, as seen in other cases. Alternatively, it suggested the dissolved fetus has the same status as a corpse whose shape was destroyed, which would be considered to be pure. It sources this latter point. Others, however, disagree and say such a corpse would still give off impurity. Now, if a woman gives birth to a hand with visible fingers, the mother has impurity, and we presume it came from a complete fetus, and she has no pure days. However, as we say, it's possible she's been expelling the fetus for a while now, and her pure day period has passed. It quotes some related cases. Also, if a fetus stuck its hand out of a womb and pulled it back in, the woman has impurity from childbirth, at least rabbinically. The leniency of pure days does not apply until majority of the fetus is born. This is rabbinic, but there's some scriptural support for this. New Mishnah. If a woman miscarried a tumtum or an androgynous, a child with a genital defect, she observes days of impurity with the stringencies of a male and a female. If she had twins, one as a tumtum and a regular male, or an androgynous and a regular male, she has impurity with the stringencies of both a male and a female birth. If she has a tumtum and a female, or an androgynous and a female, she just follows the laws of impurity as if she had a female. If a fetus comes out in pieces or feet first, it's considered born when most of it comes out. If it comes out in the typical manner, it's considered born when majority of its head comes out, which is when the forehead comes out. The Gemara says, it's relevant to teach the case of a tumtum or androgynous and the regular male, in spite of seeming redundancies, as there's a concern that both the births could be different genders. Related, if a tumtum or androgynous have some sort of a fluid discharge from themselves, which resembles a male's or a female's in color, by being white or red accordingly, there's no liability for them entering the temple with impurity, and they don't contaminate teruma tithes with impurity. If they had both this red and white discharge at the same time, they would be liable for all this. It additionally discusses proofs and sources for this concept. They would be able, however, to contaminate with other forms of impurity. If the fetus comes out in pieces, we said it's considered a birth once majority exits. There's a dispute if the head comes out first, before majority, if it's considered to be born then. They would agree by a regular birth that the head coming out is what constitutes birth, even if it's a miscarriage. Here, they dispute whether the head is considered to have any significance. It disputes between these opinions at length. New Mishnah. If a woman miscarried and she's not sure which gender it was, she observes impurity for having a male and a female. If she's not even sure if it was a fetus, she just knows something was discharged, she has impurity for the days of a male birth, a female birth, and of a Niddah. The Gemara says there's contradictory cases. Where a woman gives birth into a river, it was ruled we presume she miscarried a fetus, not just an empty amniotic sac. As that's what typically happens, so they're following the majority of cases. Our ending case is different, as the woman also needs to follow impurity of a Niddah, which would imply that there's a possibility she miscarried an amniotic sac, as our case is where it's not been established that she was pregnant. To dispute this opinion, we quote a case that says if a pregnant animal leaves a field and comes back not pregnant, the next animal it gives birth to is a doubtful firstborn, but shouldn't we follow the majority that it was a proper miscarriage, not just an empty amniotic sac? So it's answered here it hadn't had a discharge from the womb the prior day, so there's no majority presumption it's carrying a fetus. It attempts another disproof. If a woman was pregnant, left, and comes back not pregnant, and she she testified that she had 3 weeks of no menstruation, and then she had 10 alternating weeks of menstruation. According to one opinion, she can immerse at the end of the entire doubtful period, and she'd only be permitted to her husband on the eve of the 35th day, which is explained at length. There are other opinions also as to when and how many times she immerses. Beis Shammai says she must immerse 95 times. This is as during the first week there's a concern she had a male or a female birth, or she's finishing her pure days, so she immerses 7 times by night by each day. Then, by the second week, she could have immersion for possibly having a female birth continuing, and that she could be finishing her pure days, so 7 by night, and a possible male or possible female birth while she has Zivah impurity, so another 7 by day in that week, so 14. And then in week 3, she could be finishing her impure days, so 7 immersions by night, and 7 for possibly having a female as a Zivah in the mornings, so that's another 14. And then for every remaining week, she could have concluded her pure days, so 7 for each of those, and 3 in the 12th week. And there's then a 95th day if she arrived initially during twilight of the prior day, so we add to 95. Beis Hillel says there are 35 immersions. This is as he says there's 7 immersions in the first week for a possible male or female birth, 14 in the next week for immersions by morning and night for a possible male and female birth during a Zivah period, and continuing for the possible female birth, and then the 7 in the next week continuing for the possible female birth in the Zivah period, and then in the 5th week she does 7 for being a possible Niddah. These are all individually qualified. And this is in accordance with the view that the 7 days of Zivah impurity need to have certain knowledge that there was no blood flow, that biblically cohabitation would be permitted on the last day of being a Zivah after she immerses, and that both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that immersion must be done the moment somebody is able to, which is why they have to keep on repeatedly immersing. The one who said it's sufficient to just immerse once after all of this doubtful period holds that there's no need to immerse immediately, and it could just be done at the very end. New Mishnah. If a woman miscarries on the 40th day after conception, we don't assume it was a valid child, so she doesn't have impurity. If she miscarried something on the 41st day, she must observe impurity for having a male, a female, or for being a Niddah. Others disagree and say she just needs to have impurity for a male or for a Niddah, and if she miscarries on the 81st day, she does it for all 3, as he holds a male embryo is completed by the 41st day of development, while a female embryo is completed on the 81st day of development. The former opinion holds that both take 41 days. The Gemara says it discusses the possibility of a male child, which is the least stringent opinion, as it's possible she could have a blood discharge on the 34th day from her miscarriage, and then another on the 41st day, so out of concern it was a male, she wouldn't be allowed to immerse in a mikveh until day 48. The same stringency applies to a female, as if she has a miscarriage on day 74 and another on day 81, she cannot immerse in a mikveh until day 88. We mentioned there was a debate as to how long a female embryo takes to develop. Some say 40 days, some say 80. It attempts to prove either way from the implication of some scriptural verses, or a recorded incident where the Queen Cleopatra had 2 of her maidservants executed and found a male and a female fetus developing within them at the same rate. And it's explained that before this process, they had both taken a drug to eliminate any prior pregnancy before the test was conducted, so that way they would be pregnant for the same length of time. And this disagreeing opinion said that sometimes such drugs are not effective, so it was an invalid test. There's variation on this conversation that's quoted. It speaks on the nature of a fetus, how it's curled inside of the mother's womb, and it's fed by its mother. It says it can see across the entire world when it's in the womb, in the same manner that a man sees across the entire world when he dreams. It said that those are the best days of a person's life, and also that the unborn child spends the entire time in there learning Torah and being taught by angels, and when it's time for it to leave, it's struck on the mouth and it forgets everything. Some say it only leaves the womb once it takes an oath to God, which is to become a righteous person and not a wicked one. And even if the entire world tells you that you're righteous, you should still be in your own eyes like a wicked person. This line is lengthily expounded on in the foundational Hasidic work of the Tanya. He also takes an oath to be aware of the purity of God in his own soul, and that he should guard it or it will be taken back. It also speaks on the development of a child in the womb. It said it starts in a lower chamber and then moves up, and it's also said that childbirth for a female is more difficult as they start off face up and need to flip over. It also speaks on the dangers of intercourse with a pregnant woman during certain stages of pregnancy, as it could potentially damage the child. It said there are 3 partners in the creation of a person. The father, who contributes to the bones, sinews, nails, brain, and the sclera, all the white parts, while the woman contributes to all the red parts, the skin, flesh, hair, and pupil. And God gives the person his soul, his facial countenance, his eyesight, his hearing, his speech, the ability to walk, and insight and understanding. And when a person dies, God takes his portion and the rest remains. It additionally speaks on the miraculous nature of childbirth, how it grows inside of a woman, how every child is unique, even from the same parent. It said that man isn't even created from all the seed during cohabitation. He is created from the single most select drop from it, and that God oversees the entire process. It said that if somebody wants to ensure that he will have a male child, he should take care to not complete his act of cohabitation before his wife does. Some say a woman conceives only close to her menstrual cycle, others say it's only after immersing in a mikveh. It explains a number of other verses on this. It asks why a woman would need to even bring a sin offering to the temple after giving birth, and some say it's because while she was in childbirth, due to the pain, she might swear against cohabiting with her husband again, so she would now need to bring a sin offering depending on whether she had a male or a female, although that doesn't make much sense, as it would be a knowing violation, and it wouldn't even be a bird offering. It would have to be an animal offering. The reason circumcision is done on the 8th day specifically is so the husband and wife will no longer be prohibited to each other by the celebrations. It's so that man pursues after women, as opposed to the other way around, as Eve was taken from a portion of man, and that's why men and women cohabit facing their respective directions. Men face the earth where they came from, and women face man where they came from. It's also said that this is why men are more pacifiable than women, as they initially came from earth, while women have nicer singing voices as they come from bone. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Niddah continues covering the various laws of impurity from discharges. The first Mishnah says there are types of emission impurities. A Niddah, where if a woman finds she menstruated, she's impure as a Niddah for 7 days before she immerses herself. The 11 days after this are called Zivah days, where if the woman has another blood discharge, it's considered abnormal, called Zivah, and she'd become impure again for a day. If she had 3 Zivah days in a row, she needs to count 7 new days and would need to bring an offering on the 8th, and from there, her menstrual cycle can restart. A man has a similar equivalent called a Zav. A male would become impure from a seminal emission, and he can immerse immediately. If he has multiple days in a row or multiple emissions in one day, that's called a Zav, and he'd also need to bring an offering when he immerses. It was ruled Kuthian women, the converts from the region of Samaria, are considered to have a permanent status of a Niddah from birth in that they make things impure through contact. Kuthian men have the impure status of a Zav, as they're viewed as men who cohabit with Niddahs, as Kuthian women didn't properly follow the laws of Niddah impurity back in those days. However, the objects they make impure have a slightly doubtful status, and they could be brought into the temple and they won't make teruma tithes impure. The Gemara clarifies, the reason there's a concern of menstruation from birth is that they have an unknown status, and there's a concern of the very rare minority that an infant could have menstruated. It sources the opinion that we're concerned for such a minority case, which is the view that we don't allow anybody underage to perform the levirate marriage out of the small concern that they could be infertile. Now, this is a frequent minority, and so too bleeding by an infant, based on some quoted cases, was also a frequent minority. The case in question involved immersion of a child to make it pure, so that way it could be anointed with teruma tithe oil. Based on a scriptural exposition, however, for most people, this would only apply to adult women, but it doesn't apply to Kuthians, as mentioned. It also sources that there's contamination of impurity through anybody doing intercourse, even somebody who's completely prohibited against doing any active intercourse, such as a child, which was rabbinically instituted. A male, however, is explained to be excluded from menstrual impurity if he bleeds from his organ, applying to any sort of red fluid. So it sources the fact that the laws of Niddah and Zivah impurity apply to every woman of all ages, from an infant to an adult. The same applies to males too, that they can become impure from Zav impurity, being from an infant until an adult. It sources this in that a woman would not be impure from a white discharge. It needs to specify that there is emission impurity even by both male and female infants, as they both have stringencies, as males can become impure through multiple emissions on the same day, while females can become impure from even due to a menstrual discharge from an external stimulus, like by jumping repeatedly. When we said a Kuthian would generate impurity, this is defined as an object that's beneath somebody who cohabits with a Niddah, that it has the same laws of impurity of an object that was on somebody with Zav impurity, which is that it only contaminates food and liquids, not people or objects. It sources these principles proving that Zav impurity cannot contaminate people or objects, and that then the same would apply with impurity from cohabiting with a Niddah. Others say actually the one who cohabits with a Niddah has the same degree of impurity as if he was the Niddah himself, and that he'd contaminate even people or his own clothing through contact. When we said Kuthian men are considered to have cohabited with Niddahs, that applies specifically to married men. When it said that Kuthian women don't abide by the laws of Niddah properly, this is described as they'd wait a 7-day period after any colored discharge, which could then run into a proper discharge, and they wouldn't wait the full amount for the second one. Alternatively, it's as they count the day their Zivah purity stops as the first day of her 7-day count, when she should actually be starting on the following day. The issue with this interpretation is that it proves that part of a day is considered a whole day by these laws, so it could still technically be fine. It asks, after a woman's Zivah impurity, if after intercourse she discharges seminal fluid, it disputes if this would cancel her 7-day count, depending on the degree of impurity. It sources that this could actually be an issue of impurity. We've said by an object contaminated by a Kuthian, there's no liability if it's brought into the temple, and that teruma doesn't need to be burned if it comes in contact with such an object, as the impure object has a questionable status. status. It quotes some particular cases on the subject. New Mishnah. On the Sadducees, which was a heretical sect of that time, if the woman follows their familial custom, they have the same status as a Kuthian, meaning they have a constant Niddah status. If they follow the proper laws, they're treated typically. Rabbi Yossi says that they're treated typically unless they actively abide by the Sadducee customs. The Gemara says, if there's a Sadducee woman who people just don't know the status of, it proves she's presumed to be a Niddah. It quotes an instance of this where a Sadducee was speaking to a Kohen Gadol and some saliva got on the Kohen Gadol's clothes. So he confirmed with the wife that she hadn't menstruated, as they were still trusted when they show blood samples. There was also no concern that the Sadducee was an ignoramus, who are presumed to have their own impurity status, as it was during the pilgrimage festival when nobody is assumed to have that status. New Mishnah. By the menstrual blood of a non-Jewish woman, and also by the pure blood of a woman with leprosy after childbirth, Beis Shammai says they're always considered to be pure. Beis Hillel says they're only impure when moist and are otherwise considered to be pure. By the blood of a woman after childbirth that hadn't yet immersed in a mikvah, Beis Shammai says it only generates impurity when dry. Beis Hillel says it only generates impurity. Beis Shammai concedes by a woman who gives birth while she was a Zivah that she generates impurity from her blood always. The Gemara sources these principles, explaining the individual logics. It's also a dispute regarding the Zov discharge of a non-Jewish man. Beis Shammai says it's impure. Beis Hillel says there's no impurity from the regular emissions, as there would be by a Zov emission, although it's only rabbinic, so it's establishing a difference so that people don't impermissibly burn teruma or sanctified foods that come in contact with a non-Jewish person, as that would not cause any impurity. So it essentially proves that there's no impurity from the seminal fluid of a non-Jewish person, not even rabbinically, while there would be by a Jewish person. If the fluid was in a woman's womb for 3 days, it's considered non-viable and would not generate impurity at this point. We know this applies if it's in a Jewish woman, and as for if it's in a non-Jewish woman, as they have different diets and presumably different body temperatures, that stands unresolved. Regarding the debate by the pure blood of a Metzora, Beis Shammai says it's always impure. Beis Hillel says it's impure when moist. It sources these individual opinions. Now, the first discharge of a Zov has a lesser status of impurity. If a minor has this first discharge, as his emissions normally don't have impurity, it could possibly be an exception. However, it sources that his first Zov charge would still have this impure status. It's also asked about the first Zivah discharge of a Metzora woman, if it will create carrying impurity, and that's a disputed point, although it proves it would. It's said that a Zov's first discharge would generate impurity even if caused by a stimulus, which I spent some time discussing and quoting verses on. That's discussed, and it also describes the physical differences in appearance between a Zov discharge and a typical emission. It also additionally explains the dispute by a woman who gave birth and hasn't yet immersed. Beis Shammai said her blood is only impure if moist. Beis Hillel says it's always impure. This is clarified to be based on a dispute where the woman gave birth as a Zivah, and it's where she hasn't yet counted 7 clean days. As Beis Shammai would say, she's biblically considered pure, and Beis Hillel says she's biblically impure. In fact, there's a general dispute. Some say there's only one source of blood in that area, and others say there are 2 sources of blood, one which expels pure blood and one expels impure blood. There's a practical difference between these views if a woman continuously discharged blood from her impure days into her pure days. As the first opinion says, it just goes by the time, so it would become pure, while the latter opinion would say the blood still comes from the impure source, so it's impure. It additionally disputes this latter view from a few cases. These are additionally discussed trying to refute the view that pure and impure blood come from different locations in the body, and then it tries to refute the former opinion that they come from one source. In the end, it says we rule like the former opinion, the menstrual blood, whether it's pure or impure, comes from a single source. New Mishnah. If a woman bleeds while she's in labor, she's considered a Niddah. If a woman bleeds in labor for 3 days in a row during the 11 potential Zivah days, and then nothing happened for a full day, and then she gave birth, Rabbi Eliezer says it's like she gave birth while in Zivah impurity. Rabbi Yeshua says it must be a night and a day that passes. When we say nothing happened here, it just means that there was no labor pain. There could still be blood. The length of time that a labor can last to be able to attribute any blood discharges as part of the childbirth, Rabbi Meir says even 40 or 50 days. Rabbi Yehuda says it would be connected if the bleeding was in the month of childbirth, while Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say that there is no labor longer than 2 weeks. The Gemara clarifies, if a woman bleeds while in labor, some say this is only a concern for a single day. Others say there's a concern nothing will happen after for a day, which could retroactively make her a Zivah, so she needs to wait further. Others say if a woman bleeds in labor, she has no impure status from this if she bleeds during her Zivah days. This is supported from some quoted cases. It also sources scripturally the fact that bleeding in labor cannot contribute to a Zivah period, and why this only applies here and not by a Niddah. It describes the debate between the sages on these laws. It asks, does bleeding in labor cancel the count of clean days for a Zivah? As perhaps not, as it cannot cause a Zivah period. So that's disputed further, and it proves that is the case, that as it cannot cause a Zivah period, it cannot cancel the count of clean days. It's also said that childbirth does not cancel the 7-day count for Zivah. Regarding the impure days after childbirth in this sequence, some say they don't cancel any count of days, but they don't count towards the remaining clean days, while others say they would even count towards pure days. It sources these individual opinions. They debate further and they're additionally discussed. Anyways, we said if a woman was bleeding in labor for 3 days in a row of her Zivah period, and then she had a day of nothing, and then she gave birth, she's given birth as a Zivah. We said this nothing refers to having no pain. If she had both no pain and no bleeding, it's a dispute. Some say she's still impure, others say she's pure, as the labor pains earlier are clearly associated with the birth, even if there was a break in between. It disputes that from a few separate cases. Rabbi Meir had stated that the length of the woman's labor for her blood discharge to be attributed to the childbirth can even be 40 or 50 days. He specifies both, as 50 days refers to a sick woman and 40 days refers to a healthy woman. We said if somebody bleeds in labor, they're pure if the bleeding occurred during Zivah days, but not so if this was during Niddah days. Some say these pure blood emissions only occur during the 11 Zivah days, as these are the days when a woman can become a Zivah. Others say she'd even be pure after. The first opinion would take issue with Rabbi Meir saying labor can be 40 or 50 days, as he limited it to an 11-day period. So he just explains that Rabbi Meir is saying labor could be for that long, but his opinion still stands that there's no impurity for bleeding during the 11 Zivah days only. There's variation on this. It's quoted, there could be a woman in labor who bleeds for 150 days in a row, but none will be of Zivah impurity theoretically. This would be if she bleeds on the last 2 days of her Zivah days, then bleeds for 7 more days, and then the 2 days after, then for 50 days in labor, which don't count because it's part of the childbirth. Then she can bleed for 80 days after if she had a girl, then 7 Niddah days, and then the 2 days after. That's clarified. Or a woman could discharge blood for 100 days in a row without causing Zivah impurity. If she bleeds in the last 2 days of the Zivah cycle, then for the entire Niddah period, 2 days after, then 80 days to birth a female, then 7 Niddah days, then 2 days after, which is according to the opinion that the womb can open without discharging blood. Anyways, Rabbi Yehuda said she connected her bleeding to the birth during that month. This could result in astringency, as if she was in labor for 2 days at the end of her 8th month, and then gives birth on the first day of the 9th. The prior bleeding would be as a Zivah, as it's in a separate month, and she'd be impure as having given birth as a Zivah. On the other hand, if she was in labor for 1 day at the beginning of the 8th month, and for 2 days at the beginning of her 9th month, even if she gives birth at the end of the entire month, she hasn't given birth as a Zivah. Some say this means he holds that the labor can start any time after the 9th month begins. Seemingly others disagree, saying 270 days must pass for a birth to be viable. However, it's explained this is just in reference to an older practice of people who would only cohabit on Wednesdays, so that way the birth would end up on a Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday, and not on a Shabbos. That's sourced along with the remaining opinions, and it quotes a few unique cases. New Mishnah. If a woman bleeds in labor within the 80 days of giving birth to a female, any blood she discharges is pure up until when the child is born. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he says it would be impure. He uniquely sources this from a verse. The Gemara then discusses this dispute, quoting further sources for their individually held principles. New Mishnah. During the 11 days of potential Zivah, a woman is presumed to be pure. As a general rule, if a woman did not examine herself, whether this was accidental, intentional, or beyond her control, she's pure. If the time for her fixed cycle arrived and she hasn't checked herself, she's impure. Rabbi Meir says if she was in hiding from besieging troops, for instance, and she didn't check herself during her fixed cycle, she's pure, as we presume her fear delayed her menstruation. On the original point, during the counting days of a Zava, or somebody during their day after having 2 discharges, they're presumed to be impure unless otherwise proven. The Gemara clarifies, it means that during the 11 Zivah days, a woman is presumed to be pure, but she doesn't need to examine herself. But during the potential Niddah days, a woman would need to examine herself, but if she doesn't, it's fine and she's assumed to be pure. Alternatively, this is explained to mean that it's according to the opinion which says that a woman without a fixed cycle is not allowed to cohabit, so it's teaching that this would not apply during the Zivah days. If this forbidden cohabitation was done during the Niddah period, they would need a divorce, as they might then cohabit during an actual Niddah cycle. It also clarifies the wording to show this refers to somebody without a fixed cycle, as if she had one outside of that time, she could be with her husband, assuming she examines herself. But if she hadn't examined herself, it's fine. But this would not be allowed during her actual fixed cycle. Then there's a refuted interpretation, and lastly, it's explained to mean that a woman cannot establish a fixed cycle based on discharges during her Zivah period. There's related discussion on this quoted. It also disputes if a woman does have recurring discharges during this Zivah period, if that's something she needs to take into account and be concerned for. A case is quoted, and it's explained to be that a woman discharged on the 1st of a month, and the 1st of a second month, the 25th of the second month, and the 1st of a third month during her actual Niddah days. But it establishes a fixed cycle, as we don't take the 25th date discharge into account, as we assume that that just came from a blood accumulation and her actual cycle was on the 1st of the month. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Niddah continues on principles of childbirth and impurity. The first Mishnah says, as was spoken on in chapter 3, if a woman has a male, she's impure for 7 days and pure for 33 days. If she has a female, she's impure for 14 days and pure for 66 days, as stated in scripture. Now, if a woman has a child via C-section, the mother does not count any of these days of purity or impurity, and she wouldn't need to bring the temple offerings as existed back then when it was relevant. Although Rabbi Shimon would disagree, and he says the child is treated just like a regular birth. Related, all women become contaminated with impurity once menstrual blood is present in the outer room, as illustrated in this helpful chart. This is unlike a male with Zivah impurity or their emissions, as that must fully exit their body to make them impure, meaning if a Kohen feels he's about to have an emission while he's eating teruma tithes, which must be done in a state of purity, he should squeeze his organ shut and swallow what he's eaten. Also, these male and female emissions cause impurity in any amount, no matter how small they are. The Gemara explains the dispute on if a C-section is considered a typical birth is one based on the implication of some quoted verses. It also sources the inclusion of giving birth to a tumtum or androgynous, that's considered to be a birth, along with additional principles. However, Rabbi Shimon would clarify that this only applies by a person. By an animal, if it's born via C-section, it's not considered to be a proper birth. Anyways, as Rabbi Shimon disagreed and said a woman's C-section is considered a proper birth, this means if a woman is in labor for 3 days during her 11-day Zivah period, as discussed in the prior chapter, and she discharges blood on each of these 3 days, and then right after has a child via C-section, it would be a dispute if she has given birth as a Zivah and whether the blood is impure if it came from the womb. Others disagree into the cases that the child and the blood in question came through the incision, and they disagree whether the uterus itself is impure. Now others explain that it goes by if the blood is considered to be a Niddah discharge, making the woman and the blood possibly pure or impure. Although others disagree with the last opinion, as they say since the blood came through the abdominal incision, the blood wouldn't be considered Niddah menstrual blood at all, and it wouldn't make her impure. Related, if part of a woman's uterus falls out, the woman is impure for a day until nightfall. If a woman has a clear discharge, she is impure for a day. This applies if 2 drops come out to ensure it was from the uterus. It defines more specifically where the outer room is in regards to female anatomy. Additionally, as we've said, blood in that area makes a woman impure as a Niddah. Blood in that location would also make the woman impure during her Zivah period. If seed exits the woman's body, she becomes impure, but if it's still inside of her, that's a dispute. Some say it would only make her impure during the actual act of cohabitation, meaning if she cohabited, she immersed, evidently in her actual bed in this case, waited 3 days as she's impure during that period, so she just lay on her stomach so nothing would fall out, and then had an emission of seed, she's only impure from that if it actually left her body. If she had remained on her back, she would have definitely had an emission, so she'd be impure after. If a woman has an emission of seed after cohabitation, it asks if this is considered impurity through a discharge or through contact with such a substance. This is practically irrelevant if it cancels the woman's 7-day Zivah count, or if it can create impurity also when it's inside of her. It's said by several to be a discharge contamination. Related, it's said if a woman gives birth and has blood inside of her, she's impure. Even as she went to Immersion and mikvah, she'd remain impure from the blood that's inside of her. This is as it's compared to the blood of an improperly slaughtered bird, which can contaminate a person and his clothing with impurity while it's in their actual throat. This is as it's specifying that the blood inside the woman does not get purified through immersion in the mikvah. The reason the case of childbirth was mentioned, even though she'd typically be having a Niddah or a Zivah discharge anyways, as this case is where the fetus put its head from the corridor into the outer room. So it's saying that such a thing would contaminate with impurity once the fetus is in that area, even though it's not strictly outside yet. This is supported from further cases. If an impure object was placed in the outer room of a woman, it asks if this is considered to be swallowed impurity or concealed impurity, neither of which can transmit impurity further. However, this is relevant if the item inserted is impure through concealment. It cannot contaminate through contact, but it could make her impure through carrying, and would make the woman impure. So it's a dispute between opinions on this status. If there was an impure object in one's throat, it's also asked if this is considered swallowed or concealed impurity, which is again relevant if it's through concealment. It cannot contaminate through contact, but it can through carrying. A source implies that the item in his throat is swallowed impurity and won't contaminate through contact or carrying. If somebody has an impure sheretz in a fold of his body, like his underarm for example, he'd still be pure, as it's a concealed place, so there's no impurity through contact. If it was an improperly slaughtered animal, that spreads impurity through carrying, so there he would be impure. Or if somebody has a sheretz in such a location and enters into an earthenware oven, the oven would then become impure. That's additionally sourced. If a rod is by somebody with Zav impurities underarm, and he used it to move somebody that's pure, that man would remain pure. But if the man with the rod was pure, and he moved somebody with Zav impurity, the first man would not be impure. It additionally sources each of these principles. We said if a Kohen was eating teruma and he felt he was about to have an emission, he should close off his organ to prevent impurity while eating teruma. However, as was discussed in chapter 2, it's improper for somebody to touch himself there. So some say that this should only be done with a thick cloth. Others say it's fine, as it won't increase the already existing issue. Related, according to some, the only way an emission can generate impurity is if it's accompanied by a sensation. Alternatively, it's only if it's expelled with force. Or alternatively, he says if it's lacking that factor of force, it'll be unable to fertilize, but it could cause impurity. There are additional unresolved queries on this. We said male and female discharges can generate impurity in any amount, no matter how small. Others say a Zivah discharge needs to be enough to stop up the organ, so that's a disputing opinion, and they additionally debate. Alternatively, it's held that an emission from a male contaminates impurity in any amount, but if somebody else comes in contact with that, they'd only be impure if it was at least the size of a lentil. This is similar to a sheretz in these respects. New Mishnah. Impurity by a female and a male through menstruation or emission starts from birth. An infant can also become impure through contact with tsaras leprosy. They could become impure by somebody who came in contact with the corpse. They could be connected to their widowed sister-in-law to eventually perform the levirate marriage. They prevent their mother from ever needing to do the levirate marriage as she's had a child. They'd cause their non-Kohen mother who's married to a Kohen to be able to eat teruma, and they could prevent their mother from eating teruma, which will be explained. An infant can inherit and bequeath. There's liability for the death penalty for killing an infant, and he's to his entire family like a full bridegroom, which will be explained later to mean that his family must mourn his passing. The Gemara spent some time sourcing that all of these laws and types of impurity apply to everybody of all ages, even in infants. When it said it can prevent his mother from eating teruma tithes, this means if a female Kohen marries a non-Kohen, if she has a child with him, she can no longer eat teruma. However, this would also apply even if it was a fetus. So the case that's specified here is where a Kohen has two wives, one who is a divorcee, so the Kohen wasn't allowed to marry her in the first place, the regular wife he has sons with, and he has a newborn with the divorcee wife. And it's saying that the newborn would disqualify his father's slaves from eating teruma, while a fetus wouldn't do this. We said an infant can inherit and bequeath. Some explain this to mean that he can inherit from his mother, and if he dies, he can bequeath it to his paternal half-brother, which wouldn't apply if he was a fetus, as then he'd die before the mother, because he's a fetus. Or it's just saying that this means he reduces the portion of the firstborn, which only applies to a newborn, not a fetus. When we said the infant is considered to be a bridegroom, it means his family must mourn his passing as if he were a bridegroom. Additionally, a day-old infant is considered viable as a living child, assuming it was carried fully to term. New Mishnah. Cohabitation with a girl under 3 years old is strictly forbidden. From 3 until 12, a girl also cannot be married as she cannot consent. However, a father can marry his daughter off during this period, although doing so is extremely frowned upon as stated in earlier tractates on Condition 41a, and would definitively not be permitted nowadays at all due to the principles of Dinah Demachos Dinah, the fact that there's a religious obligation to abide by the law of the country you're in. However, if unfortunately this was still done, it's discussed. Between this age, a girl can be married off by her father to be betrothed or to perform the levirate marriage. If she is married, her husband would be held liable for committing adultery. She could cause impurity through Niddah, menstrual impurity. She can eat teruma if she married a Kohen. If a disqualified person cohabits with her, she is disqualified from ever marrying a Kohen. And if any of her relatives cohabit with her, they would receive the death penalty, while she would not. Cohabitation with a girl under 3 years old is completely prohibited. It's not even considered to be an act of cohabitation, so the man who did this act of assault would be punished accordingly, as was spoken on in earlier tractates, and the child would not be held responsible for anything. The Gemara says, there's a dispute as to when this status change from a child to a minor occurs. Some say it's on the last day of her 3rd year, others say it's on the first day after. Some define it as 30 days into a year could count sufficiently to be a year, so they could change their status at 2 years and 30 days. Again, this is an application to betrothal through cohabitation after this stage, assuming the father chose to marry her off. Not only was this strictly frowned upon back then, as stated in the Gemara itself, it was looked upon so negatively that it was effectively rabbinically prohibited. However, it's additionally completely forbidden now, both by Torah law and legal law. It defines the principle that a child under 3 years cannot have a physical act of cohabitation, which is why it's strictly forbidden, and it said it has no legal significance towards the woman, besides to make the man get punished, as it's not even considered a removal of the girl's virginity. It says one of the Roman emperor's granddaughters reported she had a child when she was 7, which is said to be physically impossible, so perhaps that was just some rare exception, or she was lying. There was another case, a woman reported she had been assaulted as a child and was ruled that she could marry a Kohen, as taught from tradition from Mount Sinai in spite of that. New Mishnah. The same applies by a male. Beneath 9 years old, he's considered physically incapable of cohabiting, and from 9 to 13, he also cannot consent, but there is legal significance to his act of cohabitation, so they can perform the levirate marriage, but they cannot divorce until they're an adult. They become impure by being with a Niddah. They could disqualify a female Kohen from eating Truma by cohabiting with her, although he cannot allow a woman to eat Truma if he's a Kohen and cohabits with her. If he commits bestiality, the animal is disqualified from being offered on the altar, and the animal could be stoned. And if he cohabits with any of his relatives, they would be put to death, but as he's a minor, he would not be. The Gemara clarifies, if he marries somebody through Yibum, he doesn't need to do chalitza to divorce her, he just needs to give her the divorce document. New Mishnah. If a girl is from 11 years and a day old until 12, if she takes a vow, they're taken seriously to the point that it's examined to see if it'll be binding. If she's older than 12, she could take vows. Similarly, a boy who's 12 and a day until he's 13, his vows are examined, and from older than 13, he can take a vow. Before these periods, they cannot take vows or consecrate items. After these periods, they can. The Gemara additionally clarifies these principles, and it says girls mature earlier than boys, but some actually reverse this, saying boys mature earlier, but it's actually said that women mature earlier, which is based on a verse, as it's clear that God gave greater powers of understanding to women than to men. During the actual 13th year of a boy, it argues if this is considered to be before or after the 13th year in regard to laws of crime and punishment, although it also discusses the application of physical signs of adulthood and when they appear throughout this period in regards to classifying somebody as an adult. It's held that hairs that grow on somebody's body immediately before their age of majority do not affect their adulthood. It bases off the principles of vows, that if somebody is capable of articulating themselves, they're liable for breaking their word, otherwise no. For instance, if a minor consecrated an item and then somebody else ate it, it's a dispute if that person has lashes based on whether this is a rabbinic or biblical principle. So that's additionally disputed. New Mishnah. By a minor girl, her father still is entitled to her fines and income earnings and can annul her vows. An adult woman is independent and her father has no authority over her. Besides for the listed ages, it describes the physical developmental signs of adulthood in a female. The Gemara additionally describes these stages. It also mentions that if somebody has a slave, they should be treated with dignity and respect, as seen by one individual who had to check his slaves for physical signs of adulthood and took care to not make it embarrassing and compensated them for this. Anyways, it further explains the signs of physical development in a woman and says we accord by the most stringent opinions here. New Mishnah. Beis Hillel says, if a female is 20 years old and hasn't had any physical signs of adulthood, she should bring proof that she's 20. And if she displays signs of being an Ilonis, essentially somebody with Turner syndrome, she cannot do chalitza or yibum. Similarly, if a 20-year-old male has no physical signs of development, he can bring proof that he's 20 and that he's a saris, somebody who's infertile, and then he, again, cannot do chalitza or yibum. Beis Shammai says they just need to be 18. Rabbi Eliezer says a male needs to be 20 and a female needs to be 18. The Gemara clarifies that they need to have the physical signs of being a saris or Ilonis accordingly. Additionally, across this entire chapter, it's generally said that the ages are calculated not according to the calendar year, but just by counting a year from the relevant date until the next time that date comes around. Others say that this is only done if it's specified that that's the case, such as that it could only apply if it's specified by the Erech vows, as seen back in Tractate Erechin. It does rule that by the 20-year-old calculation of a saris or Ilonis, it doesn't need to be a full 20 years. It can go by a calendar year, so 19 years and 30 days would be sufficient, which is further sourced. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Niddah continues covering the principles of purity and impurity. The first Mishnah says, if the lower signs of physical development in a woman appear before the upper signs, she can do chalitza or yibum. If the upper signs come before the lower signs, although that's impossible, Rabbi Meir says she can do neither, the sages say she can do either, as they say the lower signs of development definitely occurred at some point. The Gemara clarifies, Rabbi Meir holds it is possible for the upper signs of development to appear before the lower signs. The sages disagree with this. It specifies as it does to show that according to the sages, it's not possible for this to occur, so it must be that the lower signs were there but just fell out. That's further disputed, although it is agreed that it's the lower signs of development that are used to determine somebody's adulthood status, which it then sources. Some say it depends on the individual and where they're from and what they're involved in. It does clarify, all examinations of women are done by other women, which is clarified further, as there are some disputed stages where it said they shouldn't be examined. It said the testimony of a woman here is believed to issue a stringent ruling, but not a lenient one. The Mishnah concluded by restating that it's impossible for a woman to have upper signs of development before lower signs. This is possibly to say the law accords like the sages, or it's just for formatting reasons as seen in the next Mishnah. New Mishnah, similar to the prior, every earthenware vessel with a hole large enough to let in liquid can let out liquid, but it is possible to have an earthenware vessel that lets out liquid but doesn't let in liquid. Every limb with a fingernail has a bone, but not every finger with a bone has a fingernail. Every object that can become impure through being reclined on can become impure from a corpse, but an item that can become impure through a corpse does not necessarily mean it can become impure through reclining. The Gemara clarifies, if an earthenware utensil's hole is large enough that it lets in liquid, it cannot be used for the red heifer service. If there's a hole in an earthenware shard, if it can let out liquid, it's no longer classified as a shard, as it would typically be at this point discarded. It explains how to test for such a hole using water. If an extra limb has a fingernail, it transmits impurity through contact, carrying, and being under the same roof. If it has a bone but no fingernail, it transmits impurity through contact and carrying only, assuming it's on a sixth finger that's not aligned with the rest of the fingers. If it is aligned, it's treated like the others. It clarifies the principles of impurity, that a utensil that can be contaminated with corpse impurity can also not be contaminated with midras, reclining impurity, which would be something like a se'ah or a half a se'ah container. New Mishnah. Everybody fit to judge a capital case can judge a monetary case, but not everybody fit to judge a monetary case can judge a capital case. The Gemara says this refers to a convert, as he can judge monetary cases but not capital cases. Elsewhere, it also says somebody of illegitimate birth has the status, and it specifies both, as a convert can viably marry somebody Jewish, while somebody of illegitimate birth had Jewish parents. New Mishnah. Everybody qualified to judge is qualified to testify, but not everybody qualified to testify is qualified to judge. The Gemara clarifies, somebody can testify but not judge would be somebody who's blind in one eye. It clarifies as to who holds this opinion, as they say it's compared to the judging of Sara'as, leprosy, affliction. One sage would permit blind men to judge monetary cases, as he says there's a source which permits monetary cases to be judged by night, which would be unlike Sara'as examinations, and he has this overrided as it was taught by majority or was taught with the actual laws of judgment. New Mishnah. Anything subject to the Ma'aser tithe can convey food impurity, but things that convey food impurity are not necessarily subject to the Ma'aser tithe. The Gemara clarifies this refers to meat, fish, and eggs. New Mishnah. Anything subject to the Peah charity tithe is subject to the Ma'aser tithe, but things subject to the Ma'aser tithe are not necessarily subject to the Peah charity. The Gemara says this refers to figs and vegetables, which are not subject to the Peah charity, as it only applies to things that are of food, excluding flower aftergrowth and woad, and things that are protected, which would exclude ownerless crops, and things that grow from the ground, which would exclude truffles and mushrooms, and things that are gathered as one, which would exclude figs, and things that can be stored at length, which would exclude vegetables. However, Ma'aser only applies to things that are foods that are protected and that grow from the ground, which is why figs and vegetables are excluded, although garlic and onions would be subject to Peah charity, it clarifies. If endives, for example, were planted for animal consumption and then the owner changed his mind and decided that they would be for human consumption instead, he needs to re-intend this once they're detached from the ground to be subject to food impurity. This is as he holds intent while the food is attached to the ground is not considered intent, and it debates sources for this and quotes some particular cases of purity and impurity by foods. That's additionally discussed. It is conceded by Ma'aser tithes that intent on the status of the plant while it's in the ground would be effective, although that's disputed further. For instance, it proves dill is subject to Peah charity. Some try to derive from this that something used for flavor, even though it's not actually eaten as is, must therefore also be subject to food impurity, but it's counter-argued saying that this is where it's in a dip, so it's actually being eaten, as that's what it's typically used for, which it proves from a quoted case. New Mishnah. Any animal subject to the first fleece tithe is subject to the Kohanic gifts, but not everything subject to the Kohanic gifts is subject to the first fleece tithe. Any produce subject to removal from one's house by the sabbatical year, assuming it's no longer in the fields, is also subject to the sabbatical year laws, but not necessarily vice versa. The Gemara says something subject to removal and also the sabbatical year would be some specified herbs and mint leaf. Something subject to only the sabbatical year would be that herb's root and mint root. New Mishnah. Any fish with scales definitely has fins, but a fish with fins doesn't necessarily have scales. Any animal with horns has split hooves, but not all animals with split hooves have horns. The Gemara says this is relevant for the laws of kosher, of course, as a fish must have fins and scales to be kosher. Now, both are still mentioned, even though evidently it's sufficient to just identify scales to further expand and amplify the Torah, as the verse states. New Mishnah. Everything with a blessing said after has a blessing said before, but not everything with a blessing said before has a blessing said after. The Gemara says it's disputed between several as to what this refers to, as there are various opinions as to what does and does not have an after blessing, but in the end it says it could possibly be fragrances, as there's only a blessing said before on those. New Mishnah. Back to the original point, if a 12-year-old girl has physical signs of development, she can do chalitza or yibum and is subject to all the commandments of the Torah. A boy who is 13 years old and has physical signs of development is also subject to all the laws of the Torah. Additionally, if a boy has physical signs of development, as was mentioned back in Tractate Niddah, at a certain stage he could be held liable as a wayward and rebellious son. There's some dispute as to what the stage of physical development a woman would need to be in to do miyun, rejecting an arranged marriage. The Gemara says we specify that a woman, upon becoming an adult, is responsible for all of the obligations of the Torah, and also that she can do yibum and chalitza to reject the opinion that holds a woman can do chalitza as a minor. It then went and repeated the same about a boy just for formatting reasons. In regards to a miyun, arranged marriage, it's held that once the girl becomes an adult and then chooses to consummate the marriage, she's no longer able to refuse it at this point, so that's disputed from a few quoted incidents. It further describes these signs of development and also lists which stages we will like by a few other specified laws. The physical signs of adulthood are hair, 2 hairs specifically, and it then disputes in regards to follicles. Some say 2 hairs growing out of one follicle would be sufficient, which would be possible in the body. It also disputes whether they need to be in the same location. Anyways, it further disputes when the limit is until a girl can do miyun. New Mishnah. If 2 hairs on a red heifer offering are black, it's disqualified as a red heifer. By this, the 2 hairs on Saras leprosy, and in regards to physical development, there are varying opinions as to precisely how long the hair needs to be. The Gemara says we hold with the most stringent opinion, which is that the hairs must be long enough to be able to be held by one's fingernails. New Mishnah. On Niddah Zivah cycles, if a woman finds a bloodstain on her garment and doesn't know where it came from, it messes up her cycles, and she effectively needs to count the maximum amount of time to make sure she's left her Zivah period. The details of this are described in Tractate Niddah on page 8a. Rabbi Meir says if she finds a stain during her potential Zivah period, she needs to be concerned she's a Zivah. The sages say stains just don't cause concern for Zivah impurity. The Gemara explains who the sages refers to here based on individually held opinions on specific cases. He'd essentially hold that stains on 3 garments worn across 3 consecutive days would cause concern for Zivah, but stains in 3 locations on 1 garment worn for 3 days do not cause concern, as he holds a portion of the blood stain might not be from a 3rd day, it could be from a louse, for instance, which others disagree with. In fact, some hold if a woman finds a stain on a garment large enough to be divided into 3 minimum measures, she must be concerned it was accumulated from 3 Zivah discharges across 3 days. Others disagree and say it's never a concern. This is as they hold it's possible for the 3rd discharge to be during twilight, which he'd count as still a part of the 2nd day, meaning the former opinion would make a bit more sense if she did an examination during the entirety of each day's twilight period. Essentially, it clarifies the possibility that 2 of the discharges were on 1 day would apply if it's where she didn't do any examinations at all, while if she examined herself across the night period of twilight, and this is not according to the opinion way back in Tractate Shabbos and Tractate Brachos, that twilight is just a single instant, where we know the blood emissions were across 3 days. However, it is explained that the latter opinion does have disputing variations as to which version of twilight he holds exists, that it's either for a period of time or for an instant. Related, if a woman finds a blood stain on her garments, some say she retroactively contaminates herself and any consecrated foods she's eaten up until the last time she laundered the garment. Others say there would be no retroactive contamination, as then it would be more stringent than her actual discharge. Also, if a woman finds a stain on her garment and then experiences a blood flow, she can assume the stain was from the past 24 hours. Others say she can attribute it to the past calendar day. It was ruled by some that if the blood flow was within 24 hours of her finding the stain, even if it was on a different calendar day, she would not be contaminated retroactively. It disputes if this is where she later re-examines herself on the 7th day from finding the stain or from when her actual blood flow was, which proves stains would require a woman to do the re-examination on the 7th day. New Mishnah. If a woman has a discharge on twilight during the 11th day of her Zivah period, so it's possibly in her Niddah or Zivah period, or she has a discharge in the 40th day after having a male or the 80th day after having a female during twilight, they're in a doubtful status and they need to reset again as described in Immersion 8a. The Gemara clarifies we're discussing a discharge either on twilight of her 11th Zivah day, which could be either Zivah or Niddah, or it's on the 7th day of her Niddah period, which is possibly Niddah or Zivah. To further clarify, if a woman's cycle has discharges every other day in the daytime, she can be with her husband on the 8th day of her cycle and the following night, and also on 4 additional nights, like so. If her discharges occur at night, she can only cohabit on the 8th night and day. If her cycle is every 2 days, she can cohabit on the 8th, 12th, 16th, and 20th days. Day 19 is prohibited due to the delayed discharge from day 17. If the woman's cycle is every 3 days, she can cohabit on 2 days and then never again due to being a Zivah because of 3 emissions in a row. If her cycle is every 4 days, she can cohabit 1 day and that's it forever, assuming she maintains this. If her cycle is every 5 days, she can cohabit for these 3 days and then that's it. If her cycle is every 6 days, she can cohabit on these 5 days and then that's it. If it's every 7 days, she can cohabit 7 out of every 28 days. If her cycle is every 8 days, she can cohabit 15 out of every 48 days. It's 15 days, not 14, as her Niddah days where she doesn't discharge blood count toward her 7 clean days of Zivah as seen during days 37 to 43. It proves further that's the case. If her cycle is every 9 days, she can cohabit 8 days out of 18. If her cycle is every 10 days, her permitted days are the same as her Zivah days, so 3, and the same scales up mathematically from here no matter how high you go. If her cycle and then respite are the same length, then her permitted days will be the same amount as her Zivah days. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Tractate Niddah continues on laws of purity and impurity. The first Mishnah says, menstrual Niddah blood and corpse flesh convey impurity whether they're moist or dry. Azav emission, phlegm, or saliva of azav, sheretz, an animal carcass, and seminal fluid only convey impurity when moist, although if when soaked in water, warm water for a full day, they revert back to their initial state, they would convey impurity while dry. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, and he says dry flesh corpse that's dry to the point that it cannot revert if soaked in water is pure. The Gemara sources the fact that menstrual blood is impure when moist or dry. A Niddah woman would make something she reclines on, a bed or a seat, impure. Her actual blood would not do the same as derived from a verse. It also then sources that corpses convey impurity when moist or dry. Based on where it's sourced from, there is dispute if dry, crumbled corpse flesh conveys impurity, although it is agreed that corpse flesh that's crumbled to powder is pure. It is explained that similar to a bone, which forms at birth and doesn't grow back, anything like that gives off impurity, meaning teeth, hair, and nails, once detached from a corpse, do not give off impurity. Human skin does regenerate, so it should be pure, but it was ruled to be impure rabbinically to prevent people from making blankets out of human skin, for example. There is quoted variation. Flesh also can regenerate, but it leaves a scar, so it's not considered a full regeneration. It then sources that Zov impurity is only impure when moist. It clarifies the level of impurity this causes, which is to the point that if the Zivah person touches another man, that man will be impure to the point that his clothes will become impure. It then also sources that saliva of a Zov contaminates when moist, and it clarifies to what degree. Mucus here is defined as coming from the mouth, as it definitely contains some saliva. Tears are excluded as they don't come through the mouth. It does say a Zov has 9 fluids: sweat, pus, and feces, which convey no impurity at all; tears, blood, and milk by women, which convey impurity as liquids; then Zivah, emissions, saliva, and urine, which convey impurity to the highest degree, and it then sources each of these, as discussed further. Anyways, we said a sheretz causes impurity when moist. Some say a sheretz conveys impurity when dry, if its shape is intact, if it's in its complete state. For instance, dry, dead toads from the region of Mechoza, if they retain their shape, they would give off impurity. Also, some say if the sheretz was burned but retained its shape, it'll still give off impurity, although others dispute that. It sources the remaining points. To clarify, the water soaking period means for a full 24 hours, and it's a debate if the water needs to be warm across the entire process or just at the beginning. Rabbi Yossi says that completely dry flesh corpse does not give off impurity. Some clarify that it would still give off impurity as corpse dust, which is once it's large enough to fill a ladle. New Mishnah. If a dead sheretz is found in an alley, it retroactively makes any pure things impure in that region up until the point when somebody can say for sure that they checked the alley and there was no sheretz in it, or until when it was last swept. Also, by a bloodstain on a shirt, it retroactively makes any pure things impure that touched it, up until the point where somebody can say for sure that they checked the shirt and it had no bloodstain, or until when it was last laundered. Some say the sheretz or bloodstain transmit impurity when moist or dry. Others say if it's dry, it can contaminate retroactively, while a moist impurity contaminates retroactively up until when it could still be moist. The Gemara asks whether by the alley, we're saying the alley that was earlier swept, if we're presuming it was examined or swept clean, which is relevant if somebody says he swept it but didn't examine it. Or if the sheretz was found in a hole, it would have been seen by an examining but not by a sweeping. Also, by the bloodstain on the shirt, are we saying that when it was laundered, it was examined, or that it was just washed clean? There's a difference if somebody says he laundered it without examining it, or if the blood was on the edge of the garment, which wouldn't be effectively cleaned off. Some say the necessity would be in the actual examination. Others hold by the shirt it should just be laundered again and see if it fades, in which case one could know that it came from the earlier laundering. Others say a bloodstain after laundering absorbs into the material, but the point is we know an alley or a shirt are presumed to be examined when they're cleaned. The latter view that these impurities, if moist, transmit impurity retroactively up until when they'd still be moist applies only to a sheretz, as it cannot re-moisten with water, as it would just disintegrate. New Mishnah. By bloodstains on garments from the region of Rechem, it's a dispute if they're presumed to be pure or impure based on whether they come from non-Jewish or Jewish men. This is as bloodstains from a non-Jewish man's garments are pure, but if they're from a Jewish man or a Kuthian, some say they're impure, some say we don't suspect them by their bloodstains, and it could be from an animal. The Gemara suggests, as it says all non-Jewish garments with bloodstains are considered pure, this could apply to the region of Talmud, which according to some means we can accept converts from that region. It clarifies the last point, which is that bloodstains on Jewish or Kuthian converts are impure. However, garments found in the open in a Jewish city are presumably pure, as they'd be put away if they're from menstrual blood, and if the garment was in the open in a Kuthian city, then the debate applies. Some say they're impure, others say not. New Mishnah. All bloodstained garments found in a Jewish place are pure and presumably not for menstrual blood, unless they're in a room or near a room for a Niddah woman. There's a dispute on if the impure room of a Kuthian would generate impurity towards things under its roof, based on whether miscarriages were also buried in such an area. Kuthians are believed to say that they do or do not bury their miscarriages there. They're believed to say their animal has or has not had offspring. They're believed to mark off graves, but they're not believed by laws of impurity in regards to overhangs or protrusions, or by a plowed graveyard, or anything that they're considered suspect in. The Gemara sources this. The reason a Kuthian is believed to say they've buried miscarriages in an area would be where a Kuthian Kohen is eating teruma there as evidence, and we know they're competent in these laws. By them being believed on the offspring of their animal in regards to a firstborn, this is where they're sharing or working with the animal as evidence. They're trusted to mark graves, as that's referenced in scripture. They're not trusted in overhangs like trees that overhang, or protrusions like stones from a wall that cover over a graveyard, for instance, and can spread impurity. They're not trusted by a plowed graveyard. A person can blow on the ground there in such a plowed graveyard to be able to walk in that region, and if it's trampled, it's considered pure. A Kuthian would be trusted with a plowed graveyard if he walks across the entire field, at least on all the sides. But they're also not trusted by things they're suspect in, which would be by the Erevei Techumen from back in Tractate Erevin and Nesach, idolatrous libations. And that's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Tractate Niddah continues covering the laws of Niddah, impurity. The first Mishnah says, if a woman finds blood on her skin in an area opposite her genitals, she's impure, as it's presumably menstrual blood. If it was in a different area, she's pure. So if the bloodstain was on her heel or toe, she's impure. If it was on the inside of her leg or foot, she's impure. If it was on the outside or sides, she's pure. If she found a bloodstain on her garment, if it's from the belt down, she's impure. If it's from the belt up, she's pure. If it was on the sleeve, if it's where it would extend down to her lower region, she's impure. If not, she's pure. If she used the garment as a blanket, no matter where it is on the garment, she's impure. The same applies to a shawl if she wore it in her sleep. The Gemara says, if a woman sits on clean ground, stands, and then finds blood, she's pure. As to be a Niddah, she needs to feel a discharge. Others disagree that this is necessary, and it questions it from a few cases. Others simply explain the case with the blood on the ground that she's exempt, as it's like the opinion that anything not susceptible to impurity is not susceptible to the laws of stains. This would apply by the ground, and for sure to garment then. The reason a toe is concerned for Niddah blood on it, as it could be beneath that area as she walks. It would not be that it comes from her toe touching her heel, as we don't presume a transfer of impurity between locations. Uniquely, we would say blood on her knuckles would be from menstrual blood, as hands are active and can touch all areas of the body. The inside of the leg is up until and including the hamstring. It asks about a uniquely shaped bloodstain, like a ring or a straight line or drops, and those go largely unresolved. There's a case where a woman found blood on her warp thread on a loom, and she was told to reuse the loom to determine if she'd come anywhere near that area to have menstrual blood go on it, which is something that can be done if it'll result in astringency. If two women wear the same garment, if the bloodstain was opposite the lower area of the taller woman, both are impure. If it was opposite the shorter woman, just the shorter woman is impure. If a woman checked and saw her garment was clean and then lent it to another woman, and it comes back with a bloodstain, the second woman is liable for repayment and is impure. If a woman wore 3 pre-checked garments on top of each other and finds a bloodstain, if she can attribute it to an external source, like from a butcher's market, even if the innermost garment was bloodstained, she's pure. And if she can't attribute it to anything, so it must be from menstruation, then even if the outermost layer is stained, then she's impure. New Mishnah, a woman can attribute a bloodstain to things besides herself that are valid. For instance, if she slaughtered an animal, or handled garments with bloodstains, or she was near people who handled such garments, or she killed a louse, she can attribute the bloodstain to that. Although some say the bloodstain attributed to a louse is if the stain is up to the size of a split bean, and that would even apply even if she's not aware of having killed a louse. She can also attribute it to a wound from her son or husband. If she has a dry wound that could reopen somewhere on her body, she can attribute the bloodstain to that. It quotes an incident where this occurred. According to some, if an examination cloth is placed under a pillow and blood was found on it, if it's round, it's pure. If it's elongated, it's impure. The Gemara says the stain can also be attributed to reddish plant substance or sap if she'd been using that. She can only attribute her blood towards others handling bloodstained clothes if she is certain that she sat near them. It debates further if the bloodstain can be viably attributed to a louse, or possibly if it's larger to a bed bug, which it describes. It said a city with pigs has no concern for bloodstains. Some say a bloodstain of a louse can be up to the size of a split bean, and it argues further if this is until and including that amount. If there's a bloodstain larger than a split bean, but there was a dead louse attached to it, it's a dispute if she's impure as to if we can attribute it to the louse. If the woman handled blood of a bird in the amount of a split bean and then finds a bloodstain a bit larger than the size of a split bean, it said she would be impure, in spite of the fact that the attribution would be small enough from the center in either direction. It said if a stain of one type was found on her, she can attribute several types of stains to the same source. This would be like if she handled a hen, which has different shades of blood. But the quoted case where the woman was allowed to attribute a stain to an external source, this is actually still a stringency, as the entire concepts of concern by stains was rabbinically instituted. Anyways, by the ending point that if an examination cloth has blood, we only presume it from menstruation if it's elongated. It mentions that others disagree with this, and it quotes their opinions. And that's the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Tractate Niddah continues on some principles of Niddah, menstrual impurity. The first Mishnah says, if a woman was using the restroom and saw blood, Rabbi Meir says she's only impure if she was standing, while Rabbi Yossi says she'd be impure if she was standing or sitting. If a man and a woman were both using the restroom into the same basin and blood was found within, Rabbi Yossi says that the woman would be pure. Rabbi Shimon says that she's impure as men don't typically urinate blood. The Gemara clarifies the reason Rabbi Meir differentiates between sitting and standing is where the woman sits on the rim of the basin and urinates into the basin. So if the blood was menstrual, it should be on the rim of the basin as opposed to inside of the actual basin. It is said, however, that we hold the law like Rabbi Yossi, that she's pure whether she's sitting or standing. By the case of the man and woman using the same basin, it clarifies that Rabbi Meir would agree with Rabbi Yossi that she's pure here due to the extra doubt. Rabbi Shimon, who rules she's impure here, would also say she's impure if she urinated by herself while sitting. Evidently, he'd then say by the man and woman both using the restroom, there's no difference whether they're sitting or standing, the woman is impure. New Mishnah, if a woman left her garment with a non-Jewish woman or with a Jewish Niddah and gets it back with a bloodstain, she can attribute the bloodstain to the borrower. If 3 women each wore a single garment or each sat on a wooden bench and they found blood, they're all impure. If they each sat on a stone bench or on a block of a bathhouse, some say they would be pure, as if something isn't susceptible to impurity, it's not susceptible to stains. The Gemara says the non-Jewish woman in question would be menstruating, or at least according to others, fit to menstruate. There's a debate if the woman can attribute the stain to another woman who's checking a clean day after 1 day of bleeding as a Zivah, or a woman who's counting 7 clean days and hasn't yet immersed. That's disputed from some particular cases. It's also asked if a stain on a garment can be attributed to a woman who's impure herself from a stain. That's questioned further. Anyways, regarding the principle that something that cannot become impure is not susceptible to stains, he mentions this would even apply to the exterior of earthenware vessels, even though its interior would become impure. Also, a stain on a cloth that's unusable due to being smaller than 3 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths does not have stains applied to it, and it's generally said to be ruled in accordance with this opinion. New Mishnah, if 3 women were sharing a bed and blood is found beneath one of them, they're all impure. If one examined herself and found she was the source, she's impure and the others are pure. They can attribute the stain to each other, but if they're all unfit to menstruate, they're all treated as if they are fit to menstruate. The Gemara clarifies, one woman can take responsibility for the bloodstain only if she examined herself immediately after, which it clarifies. Also, when it said the women sharing a bed can attribute the stain to each other, this is to say that if a pregnant woman and a non-pregnant woman share a bed, the pregnant woman can attribute the bloodstain to the other. The same would apply to a nursing and a non-nursing woman, or to an old woman and a young woman, or to a woman who's never menstruated to a woman who has. If both have the status, then they're both treated as if they're unfit to menstruate, and they're both treated like it could have been them. New Mishnah, if 3 women were sharing a bed and blood was found under the middle one, they're all impure. If blood was found near the one closest to the wall, her and the one next to her are impure, and the outer one is pure. If blood is found under the one furthest from the wall, her and the one next to her are impure. This is as they all entered the bed from the front. If they entered the bed from the side, they're all impure. If one examines herself and found she was pure, she's pure and the others are not. If 2 examine themselves and they're found to be pure, only the last one is impure. If all 3 examine themselves and all find that they're pure, they're all actually impure, and it gives a similar analogy. The Gemara says, evidently the prior Mishnah, where there's no difference where the blood was found, it's where the women are pressing against each other. It also explains the necessity for the comparison, and it clarifies the remaining points. It also speaks on harmful speech of another person, lashon hara, which should not be accepted as truthful, although one should still be mindful of the information as seen in a few quoted cases. It's said if a bloodstain is lost into a garment and is no longer discernible, some say all possible cleaning agents should be applied, others say it should be examined section by section, which is 3 finger breadth squared pieces at a time. If a forbidden plant mixture was lost into a garment, the garment cannot be sold to a non-Jewish person or used as a donkey saddle blanket, but it can be used as a funeral shroud. This effectively implies, according to some, that the mitzvahs won't apply when Mashiach comes, as the resurrected dead will be wearing these forbidden plant mixtures. It's also said that such a garment can be dyed, and if one still cannot find the forbidden plant mixture, it's permitted to do this, which it sources. If there's a linen thread in a woolen garment, which is prohibited, if a thread is pulled out and the man doesn't know if it was fully removed, it's permitted, As where the garment is woven together, the laws of kilayim only apply rabbinically. According to some, bloodstains on dyed garments have a leniency and the woman would be pure, and they would have otherwise been prohibited, among other things, due to Vespasian's campaign that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. However, they were permitted to allow leniencies by bloodstains. New Mishnah. There are 7 cleansing agents applied to a stain on a garment before immersing it in a mikveh. These are raw saliva, split bean water, urine, alum, then there's boris, kimonia, and ashlag, which will be defined soon. If somebody did not apply these and immersed his garment and placed pure objects on it, if he then applied these cleansing agents and it did nothing to the stain is presumably a dye and it would cause no impurity. If the stain was slightly removed, the pure objects would become impure, as presumably the stain was blood, and the garment must be re-immersed. Raw saliva is defined as saliva from somebody who hasn't eaten anything that day. Split bean water is from chewed split beans separated from their peels, and urine is left standing until it's fermented. The detergents must be scrubbed each individually 3 times. They must be applied in the order listed, separately, otherwise it's ineffective. The Gemara defines further these detergents. Boris is probably aloe, kimonia is possibly saltwort, and ashlaga is ground pearl interior. It said if somebody only applied 6 detergents and then applied something which could remove dye, the stain would cause impurity, as it could still possibly be blood. If the 7 detergents were applied, then nothing happened, and then they were reapplied, and the stain comes off, the items that have contacted the stain are pure, although any future items would be impure, as he treated it like a bloodstain and it came off like a bloodstain. And it further proves that status could go according to how he's treating it, and it discusses some additional cases which it tries to base ruling from this Mishnah. For instance, it said in the end that any absorbed impurity, if it cannot come out of the item, it's pure. If it can come out and the owner objects to it, it's impure, but if it can come out and the owner does not object to it, that's a disputed point. It further defines raw saliva, which we said cannot have the person eat since the prior evening. Some classify this even further, saying the man must have slept and not eaten anything since waking. It said if somebody gets up early and studies for a long period out loud, then it's no longer considered to be raw saliva. It also spends a while defining split bean water. It disputes what kind of person this urine is coming from, and it's unresolved if each scrubbing includes a back and forth scrubbing, or if that act counts as 2 separate scrubbings. It clarifies that they must be applied in their described order. New Mishnah. If a woman has a fixed cycle, she could be considered impure from when she finds she has blood. A cycle can be established around having discharges, when she stretches, sneezes, feels pain in her lower abdomen, when she streams blood, when she has a fever, or any similar symptoms. If she establishes one of these symptoms 3 times, it can create a fixed cycle. The Gemara says, we mentioned in the first Mishnah of this entire tractate that a fixed cycle suffices to make a woman impure, but that was for days, so it repeats here to say that it could work for physical symptoms. Blood streaming refers to where she has discolored pure blood and then menstrual blood. Similar viable symptoms would be heaviness in her limb or head, or trembling or yawning. For these, it said it's established in 3 discharges, possibly even if she ate a sharp food as she did so, which could possibly be what triggered the cycle. Although some actually hold that a fixed cycle for days is then over 2 discharges, and a fixed cycle for physical symptoms is established with 1. New Mishnah. If the woman was accustomed to experiencing a menstrual cycle at the beginning of her physical symptoms, all pure items she handles during this period are impure. If her discharge was at the end of the episode, they'd be impure. Some say that days and hours can be established as fixed cycles. If a woman was accustomed to have a discharge at sunrise, she can only not cohabit by sunrise. Others say she's only forbidden during the entire night. The Gemara clarifies the opinion which says hours can be a fixed cycle. They'd say if a woman menstruates on the 6th hour of the 20th day of a month, she can cohabit until the 6th hour of that day. And if she hasn't menstruated, she can do so after the 6th hour. Also, the opinion which said if a woman has her discharge cycle by sunrise, she's forbidden for the prior night. That's where her discharge is at the end of the night. If it's at the beginning of the day, she'd be forbidden after sunrise during the day and permitted by night. Some say we do accord with this opinion. New Mishnah. If a woman was accustomed to having her discharge every 15th day and then switched to having her discharge on the 20th day, she cannot cohabit on the 15th or the 20th. If she changed twice to the 20th, this would still apply. If she changed 3 times to the 20th is prohibited and the 15th becomes permitted, as the 20th becomes her new fixed cycle. This is as a menstrual cycle is established across 3 times and it can be undone across 3 times. The Gemara says, if a woman has a discharge on the 15th, then the 16th, and then the 17th, some say she's established the cycle to being a day ahead. Others say she needs to have a 4th of these discharges to establish 3 progressions. It discusses other particular cases. Additionally, it's taught that if a woman has her discharge on the 15th and then on the 20th, both dates are prohibited. However, it adds that this would apply even if the second date was outside of her Niddah period. We said to nullify a cycle, it requires 3 dates. However, if the date was established only once or twice, it would only require 1 new date to undo it. It cites some supporting cases. New Mishnah. It said that all women menstruate, although sometimes it's red or black or a lot or a little. Others add that if a woman doesn't do this, she cannot have children. The Gemara says menstrual blood is beneficial to women, as if she has a lot, she'll have lots of children. And that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10, the final chapter of Tractate Niddah, covers some final laws of Niddah, impurity, and immersion. The first Mishnah says, as has been discussed in earlier chapters and tractates, marriage is only accepted and permissible between 2 consenting adults. However, in a theoretical case, God forbid, if somebody cohabits with a girl who hasn't yet menstruated due to her age, this is relevant to the laws of menstrual impurity, so it's discussed. In such a case, Beis Shammai says the first 4 nights of bleeding are not presumed to be menstrual blood. Beis Hillel says it's until her wound heals. If a girl is old enough to have a menstrual cycle but hasn't yet had one for whatever reason, Beis Shammai says her first night is presumed to not be from menstruation. Beis Hillel says she gets 4 nights, and assuming her wedding was on Wednesday, as cited on page 1 of Tractate Niddah, this would then extend until Shabbos night. If she's menstruated in the past, Beis Shammai says her first act of cohabitation is presumed to not be menstrual. Beis Hillel says it's the first night. The Gemara clarifies that Beis Hillel's opinion would apply if, despite her age, she had menstruated early. This is presumed, as only later in the Mishnah does it differentiate between visible blood or not, and it's similarly quoted elsewhere. There's some dispute as to the definition of when until the wound heals means. Anyways, by the second case, if they cohabited by day, it's disputed if the following nights are presumed to not be menstrual blood. That's disputed. Also, if a person cohabits with his wife for the first time and there's no blood, and then cohabits the second time and there is, it's a dispute if the blood is presumed to be impure or not, as on the one hand they just cohabited, but on the other hand it could be possible to cohabit for the first time without causing any blood flow. Some add an adult girl has her first night presumed to not be from menstruation, assuming she hasn't yet menstruated. There is a differing case where a woman was said to have 4 non-menstrual nights across 12 months. This is where 3 of the acts were separated by 2-month gaps, and she shifted stages before the last 3. Related points are quoted. By the last case, some say she actually has a period, defined as a full night and half a day where she's not presumed to menstruate. A similar opinion is stated regarding laws of purifying utensils in regards to waiting periods from back in the end of Tractate Avodah Zarah. However, there it defines a period as half a night and half a day, so 12 hours instead of hour 18. So some say here it also means 12 hours, there's just some oddities with the grammar, or it is actually 18 hours as the signing of the marriage contract takes a while. Although it does say, in contrast to all this, that a husband should cohabit with his wife by their wedding and then should abstain, as was ruled by many others. In all the Mishnah's cases, if the woman bleeds continuously across the entire period, she must examine herself to make sure she's not menstruating. Rabbi Meir says we rule like Beis Shammai here, but everywhere else by laws of discharges where there's a debate between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, he'd say to just check the color of the blood to see if it looks like menstrual blood. Others disagree, saying all blood looks the same. A woman who bleeds due to cohabitation can cohabit with her husband 3 times. If she bleeds each of those times, she must divorce, as she created a fixed cycle of menstruation due to intercourse. She should then remarry someone else and try again. It describes the examination process. If the woman in this case has a wound inside of her, she can attribute the blood to it, assuming the blood looks like wound blood. Also, if she has a regular fixed cycle during this time, she can assume it's from that. A woman is believed if she says her bleeding is from an internal wound, although there's a debate of blood from a uterus is considered impure based on whether the uterus itself is considered impure. It quotes a number of particular cases. If a woman discharges for 1 day, she waits 6 additional days to ensure she's no longer menstruating. If she discharged for 2 days, she waits 6 other days. If she discharged for 3 days, she waits 7 days. Although, to be safe, many would wait 7 days after seeing any amount of blood at all. Related, it said if a woman was in difficult labor and bled for 2 days and miscarried on the 3rd day, she must wait 7 clean days. This is as there's still menstrual bleeding and labor for a miscarriage, and the uterus always opened with a blood discharge. It mentioned 2 days of labor, even though the accepted custom is to wait 7 days after even 1 day of bleeding, as it's discussing biblical law and not tradition. Also, as held, if a woman accepts a marriage, she must wait 7 clean days before consummating the marriage. It quotes some cases of this occurring. Also, a woman who's about to immerse in a mikvah shouldn't scrub her hair at all, so her hair doesn't get detached or cling together. Also, a woman should only clean herself with very hot water before immersion, as cold water could stiffen her hair and make it harder to clean. Also, before a person immerses in a mikvah, they should wash all the folds of their body to remove any potential interpositions, as water doesn't need to enter those areas, but it needs to be able to. Also, if a woman was immersing in a mikvah, mikveh and found an interposing object on her, if she immersed immediately after scrubbing, she doesn't need to redo everything. But if she did not immerse right after scrubbing, she should redo the immersion process. Some say it goes by if she scrubbed and immersed on the same day. Also, a woman can't stand on earthenware vessels while immersing in a mikveh, because then she might do so in a bathhouse. She can stand on a block of wood if this is the case. However, if the concern here is that she won't immerse properly due to being scared of falling, she wouldn't either be allowed to stand on a block of wood. Immersion in a harbor would be prohibited out of concern there was an interposition of mud that fell off when she got out, so she didn't see it. One sage would prepare mats for his daughters to stand on, so there would be no interposition from mud. Similarly, if a woman gave sticky food to her son and then immersed, it's not valid, as there's concern it was stuck to her and fell off when she exited. Regarding bloodletting punctures, for the first 3 days they don't constitute interpositions, afterwards they would. Also, eye mucus only is an interposition if it's dried, and eye makeup is only interposition if it's on top of the eye, unless she constantly blinks. Some say if a woman immersing in a mikveh opens her eyes too wide or closes them too tightly, it's invalid. Also, she should stand in her natural position. A single knotted hair is an interposition. 3 hairs in a knot is not an interposition. 2 hairs is debated, some say it's not. If an interposition of some sort covers the majority of somebody's hair and they don't want it there, it is an interposition and invalidates the immersion. If somebody does not object to it, it's still rabbinically prohibited out of concern for the former case. It's not a concern on account of an interposition covering a minority of hair, as that itself is a rabbinic decree. It said if a Niddah wants to immerse, she should always do so by night on the night of the 7th. There are some exceptions of people immersing on the day of the 8th day out of concern for thieves or dangerous night paths or similar. Rabbinically, at least typically the woman is required to wait until nightfall of the 7th, even though she should be able to immerse right away. It said that a woman can viably scrub herself on a Sunday afternoon and then immerse on a Monday evening or even on a Tuesday evening or a Wednesday evening, as seen in a few comparisons. Others say if she must delay, she can, otherwise she shouldn't. Others say she's only allowed a 2-day lapse, and a final view says a 2-day lapse is allowed only if it's unavoidable. It's a dispute if a woman can scrub and immerse herself on the same night. There's further discussion, although in practice it's said a woman should scrub herself by day and immerse by night, and if that's not possible, she can also scrub by night. New Mishnah. If a Niddah examines herself in the morning of the 7th day of her Niddah cycle and found she's pure, and at twilight did not perform the additional examination, and then days later rechecked and found she was impure, she's presumed to have been pure in the meanwhile. If she examined herself on the morning of the 7th day and found she was impure, and at twilight didn't do an additional examination, and a few days later found she was impure, she's presumed to have been impure in the meanwhile. In the first case, where she found she was clean on the morning of the 7th, she conveys impurity retroactively for 24 hours beforehand, or from her most recent examination. If she has a fixed cycle, however, then it suffices and there's no retroactivity. According to Rabbi Yehuda, if a woman didn't do an examination from the afternoon on, she's presumed to be impure. The sages say even if she examined herself by the morning of the 2nd day of her Niddah period and found she was pure, and at twilight did not do an additional examination, and then later rechecked and found she was impure, she's presumed to have been pure in the interim. The Gemara quotes a piece which disputes in some undefined case if a woman is a definite Zivah or a possible Zivah. It initially thinks it applies to one of the cases in our Mishnah, but then it says it refers to something totally unrelated. We said in the discussed case, the woman conveys impurity retroactively for 24 hours. This seemingly refutes an opinion from page 38b that a woman does not convey impurity retroactively, although it could still function if the point of retroactive impurity here refers to the first Mishnah of the chapter, that by the last case, if the woman becomes the Niddah, it would be retroactive like by typical cases. Also, we said if she had a fixed cycle, that would suffice. It's explained this cycle applies to retroactive impurity, although if her cycle was missed 3 times in the 11 Zivah days, that would not nullify her impurity, as we assume the blood was held in abeyance. It additionally disputes Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. New Mishnah. If a Zav or a Zava examined themselves on the first of their clean days and found they were pure, and then again on the 7th day and found they were pure, but they did not check in between, Rabbi Eliezer says they can presume they were pure, Rabbi Yeshua says they can only know they were pure on the 1st and 7th day, and Rabbi Akiva says they can only presume they were pure on the 7th day. The Gemara additionally debates sources for these opinions, and it says we follow Rabbi Eliezer here. If a Zav or a Zava examined themselves in the 1st and 8th days and they found they were pure, but they did not check in between, that's a dispute. Some say they're still considered to be pure in between, others say they only have the last day. It said a Zava who examined herself in her 3rd day can include it as part of her 7 clean days. This is relevant if she then did not examine herself until the 7th clean day. This means that the 7 clean days can just be verified just from their end, unlike earlier by a Zava checking days 1 and 8, where it implies, according to his opinion, that they can verify just from their beginning. It debates this from additional specified cases, which are then additionally discussed. New Mishnah. A Zav, Zava, a Niddah, a woman who's given birth, and a Metzora leper. If they die, they all convey impurity through carrying, at least until their corpse flesh decays. A non-Jewish person who died is pure from impurity of carrying. Beis Shammai says all women who die are presumed to be Niddahs at the time of death. Beis Hillel says this only applies if she was actually a Niddah when she died. The Gemara clarifies all corpses convey impurity by carrying. So these are specified that they convey impurity even through a heavy stone, which is instituted, so if such a person becomes sick and is assumed to be dead, this would still apply. It clarifies this further. It said some men from Alexandria asked the sages 12 things. 3 were matters of wisdom, which were on the laws discussed here. The second was to say that the daughter of a remarried divorcee can marry a Kohen. The third was that if 2 Mitzvah lepers have their offerings mixed with each other and one was offered and one leper dies, the other leper writes over all of his possessions to others so that he can bring a bird chatas as a poor man for uncertain obligations, assuming the necessary asham had already been offered. That's clarified. Then went 3 questions on verses. The verses, for I do not desire the death of the wicked man who should die, and then for Hashem desire to kill them. The first is in reference to those who repent, the second is towards those who don't. Then went God who does not show favor and who does not accept a bribe, and may Hashem show favor to you. The second is explained to be referring to after the decree is issued. Thirdly, for Hashem has chosen Zion, and then for this city has aroused my anger and my wrath in me, which is explained. The second is with God's anger is after King Solomon married the Pharaoh's daughter. It said there were 3 foolish questions. It was asked if Lot's wife, who turned into a pillar of salt, if she gave off impurity. It says no, as she was salt, not a corpse. Then by Elisha resurrecting the son of the Shunammite woman, the son was alive, so he would not transmit impurity. Then it was asked, by the resurrection of the dead, will they need to be sprinkled with the purification waters? And they were answered that we'll definitely figure some solution out. Or according to some, they would just ask Moshe then. Lastly, they asked 3 matters of proper conduct. They were told if a person wants to become a scholar, they should spend more time in school and less time in business, and they should also pray to God for wisdom. They were told to become rich, a person should engage in business and have integrity and pray to God. And for sons, they were told to marry a woman appropriate for oneself, and also to abide by the proper laws of marital relations and to pray to God. Anyways, Beis Shammai said all women who die are presumed to be niddas, as all the garments of women who die are immersed, no matter their status, so that no one will be singled out and embarrassed for being a niddah when they pass. New Mishnah. If a woman dies and the revis measure of blood comes from her uterus, it covers impurity as a niddah stain and as a corpse towards the roof. Others disagree and say that it would be a niddah stain as it dislodged from her body, although they would agree if the blood came out as she was giving birth, it would convey impurity as a niddah, and some add therefore it's not considered a corpse impurity. The Gemara explains the fundamental dispute is on whether the uterus's place is impure or not. It clarifies the opinions individual logics here. Some particular cases are discussed. New Mishnah. Initially it was said that somebody in their pure days after childbirth could pour waters between vessels for the paschal offering. They then changed their mind, saying that, like Beis Hillel says, by consecrated things she's considered like somebody who touched somebody who became impure from a corpse, while Beis Shammai says she's even considered to be impure like somebody who themselves touched a corpse. The Gemara clarifies, according to their initial logic, she'd still not be allowed to touch the water. Afterwards, it says she's considered impure towards consecrated items, but evidently not to unconsecrated items, meaning unconsecrated items prepared with the purity standards of consecrated items are still not like consecrated items themselves. New Mishnah. It's agreed a woman during her pure blood after childbirth can eat ma'aser sheni and separate her challah tithe, which should be placed in a vessel nearer to the dough and designated as challah. Her spittle or pure blood that touches teruma food is pure. Beis Shammai says she needs to immerse at the end of this period to eat teruma. Beis Hillel says this isn't necessary. The Gemara explains the individual logics for each of these. New Mishnah. Last Mishnah of the chapter. If a woman discharges blood on the 11th day of her Zivah period, so has slight Zivah impurity and immerses and cohabits with her husband, they render impurity and they're liable to bring a chatas offering. Beis Hillel says they're not liable for the chatas offering. If she immersed herself by day on the 12th and had relations with her husband and then discharged blood later that day, Beis Shammai says they render impurity and bring a chatas. Beis Hillel says it wasn't right to be so hasty, but there's no impurity. They would agree if the woman discharges in the middle of the Zivah days and immerses in a mikveh that night and had relations with her husband, they render impurity and are liable for a chatas. If they immerse the following day and then had relations, it's wrong, and their impurity and chatas liability are impending to see if she has a later discharge. The Gemara says, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree. If a woman immerses at night for having a Zivah discharge that day, it's not valid. Meaning, if a woman discharges in the middle of her 11 days, immerses that night, and has relations, it would be insufficient as described. They dispute by the 11th day itself, and it further describes their logic. A related view, Beis Shammai would say by the clean day after an early Zivah day is impure rabbinically, even though she immersed earlier and didn't have her discharge, as if she discharges later that day, she would be impure retroactively. It additionally disputes this view from additionally quoted conversation. It also further proves that by the latter case, that's deemed to be improper conduct. That's according to Beis Hillel specifically. Anyways, if a woman had a Zivah discharge on day 10 of her 11 Zivah days, some say the 10th day is like the 9th and it requires an extra 10th day of observation. Others say it's like the 11th day, so it does not require an extra day of observation. There is some variation on this. Some say there's one unique law by the 11th day, essentially, that it doesn't require an additional day of observation if there's a discharge then. However, others say there's 2 laws, this and that if there's an emission on the 10th, there's no observation on the 11th. That's additionally sourced at length. So it essentially sources all of these principles and their application from verses, although according to others, their tradition from Sinai. It proves that a nighttime discharge can make a woman a Zivah, As the verse states, after her Niddah period, the implication being close to her Niddah period being by night. It ends by quoting a verse saying, the ways of the world are his. The word for ways is halichos, which could also be read as halachos, laws, meaning whoever learned the laws of Torah is destined for the world to come. And that's the end of chapter 10, and the entire Tractate Niddah. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. There are various forms of impurity. Many of these aren't especially relevant nowadays, as the general principle was that if somebody was impure from touching a corpse or certain species of animals, they wouldn't be allowed to enter the temple, eat of offerings, or eat of teruma tithes. Of the few that are relevant, one of them is Niddah impurity, which is that if a woman menstruates, she's forbidden to cohabit with her husband during that period, and must immerse in a mikveh, a designated immersion pool, at the end of it. Additionally, when a woman gives birth to a child, she's impure for a period after, the length of time depending on the gender of the child. A husband and wife should treat each other with mutual respect and dignity. This especially applies during the act of cohabitation, which should be done in a proper and modest manner. There are distinct periods of development for men and women in regard to vows, punishment, and marriage. Broadly, a boy is considered to be an adult at 13, and a girl is considered to be an adult at 12. This is when they're held responsible for the laws of the Torah. Practically speaking, there's the principle of Dinah de Machosa. Dinah, the law of the country, is the law. This essentially means that everybody has a religious obligation to abide by the laws of the country they dwell in, and violating such would be akin to violating any other law in Torah. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.